What if your entire existence, every choice, memory and emotion was the result of a single misread instruction? Not a grand cosmic event or a divine mistake, just a tiny misinterpretation at the root of you. Maybe the mind wasn't built to see clearly, only to interpret, and it got one thing wrong, and that one thing became everything. Tonight you'll step into the blurred space between language and reality, between message and meaning. You'll follow the trail of a glitch that thinks it's a person, and maybe by the end you'll wonder if you were ever supposed to be you at all. It was never the world that was confusing. It was how you understood it. A word whispered too early, a symbol mistaken for a signal, a look misread as disapproval, a silence interpreted as rejection. These weren't flaws in perception. They were the framework of you. You've been living under the illusion that reality is something you observe, that it stands still while you walk through it. But what if reality was built by how you read it? And more importantly, what if you misread the first line? Every life needs an instruction, a blueprint for how to be. But maybe yours wasn't written, maybe it was overheard, fractured, filtered, translated through someone else's pain, or projected through the shaky voice of authority. And maybe that one instruction, half heard and poorly understood, became the foundation of everything that followed. You don't remember the moment, of course. Nobody does. But the glitch was quiet. It didn't scream. It whispered something like, "You're not enough," or "Try harder," or "Stay small." It was a command disguised as care, a suggestion disguised as truth. It nestled into the folds of your consciousness, like a misplaced comma in a line of sacred text. And then it stayed. You didn't notice the change at first, but the way you interpreted love shifted. The way you sought validation twisted. The instructions you gave yourself how to smile, when to speak, what to feel, they were all tinted by that one misunderstanding. Not because you were wrong, but because your decoder was... Imagine a child handed a guidebook, but it's written in a language they almost understand. They do their best. They guess the meanings, they fill in the gaps, and they survive. But the book wasn't meant for them. It wasn't their story. It was a leftover manual from someone else's broken machine. And so every choice, every emotion, every fear they built around it becomes a castle built on sand. You're not broken. But the code you run on? It was corrupted before you even knew how to read it. And it isn't just you. It's how meaning spreads. A glitch in a parent becomes a command in a child. A misread emotion becomes a personality trait. A misunderstood moment becomes a lifelong belief. Whole generations run on instructions they never received directly but somehow obey perfectly. You weren't given the script. You became the script. The glitch doesn't scream. It speaks fluently. It becomes the lens you never remove. You interpret silence as judgment, attention as obligation, success as safety, and failure as identity. These aren't facts. They're misreadings, recursive echoes of an initial glitch that you've never questioned because it sounds so much like your own voice. But what if the glitch wasn't just in you? What if it is you? What if the self you protect, project, and perfect is the result of a single misread instruction at the base of your consciousness? A word that didn't mean what you thought it did. A lesson that wasn't meant for you. An emotion someone else handed you, and you mistook it for your own. You don't remember the first moment because it didn't arrive as lightning. It came as tone, as implication, as environment. You didn't understand the meaning, so you made one up. And it worked. It functioned. You got through school, relationships, heartbreaks. You learned how to be someone. You survived. But surviving is not the same as understanding. And now, you're starting to notice the pattern. The moments that don't fit. The loop you can't explain. The way your decisions echo the same emotional structure, again and again, no matter the surface story. It's not failure. It's not fate. It's a misread instruction running flawlessly. Tonight, we begin to trace it back. Not to change it, but to see it. To hold the glitch like a mirror. And realize you were never flawed. You were just fluent in a language that was never meant to describe you. You've been translating life through someone else's syntax. And every time you feel stuck, small, anxious, or invisible, you're not relapsing, you're obeying. The question is, what was the original command? And can you rewrite it without becoming someone else entirely? Sleep gently now. We're just beginning. The instruction is still unfolding. You didn't choose your first language. It wrapped around your neurons like warm thread before you knew what speech even meant. The words spoken around you weren't neutral. They shaped you, bent you, wired your nervous system to flinch at certain tones, to light up at others. You think you've been interpreting language ever since, but the truth is, language has been interpreting you. What if the instructions that made you weren't sentences but impressions? Half phrases. Words spoken when they thought you weren't listening. Reactions. Sighs, stumbles. A why can't you be more like? Or a not now. Or worse, silence. Children don't have logic. They have radar. They scan tone, volume, pacing. A loving word said too sharply becomes fear. A neutral phrase said during your moment of need becomes rejection. Your brain wasn't just decoding vocabulary, it was forming rules. Rules you would live by. Rules that became invisible. And some of those words rewired everything. You might remember being told you were sensitive. But what if you just heard you feel wrong? Maybe they said you think too much. But you translated that into don't trust your mind. Or they said you're so quiet, and you internalized my voice doesn't matter. Each word burrowed deeper than it should have, not because they were powerful, but because you were unprotected, and because your nervous system doesn't distinguish between suggestion and command. It just learns. By the time you reached adulthood, you had no idea how many of your thoughts weren't yours. How many of your reactions were still running on misread instructions. You felt shame and called it identity. You felt hesitation and labeled it instinct. But beneath those layers was a system built on language that never meant to be programming. You live inside a body shaped by grammar. You speak in emotional dialects inherited from moments you've forgotten. You think you're deciding, but most of the time you're repeating. That's not your fault. It's how humans work. We name things, and then the names trap us. But here's the strange part. Words can heal in the same way they hurt. A single sentence heard at the right time can feel like freedom. A phrase like "you're allowed to exist" can disarm decades of internal pressure. A quiet "that wasn't your fault" can rewire entire memories. And sometimes, it's not even the words themselves, it's the way they're said. A safe tone, a soft cadence, a silence that doesn't feel like punishment. So why does your mind hold on to the damaging ones longer? Because the misread instruction felt urgent. It felt like survival. And anything tied to survival becomes hardwired. Imagine your brain is a city of electrical pathways. Every word you heard as a child was like a blueprint for where the roads should go, and the ones charged with emotion, shame, guilt, fear, they became highways. Every time something similar happens, your brain takes the shortcut, the same road, the same reaction, the same outcome. You believe you're making a decision, but you're actually obeying the blueprint. And that blueprint wasn't even yours. That's why sometimes you hear a compliment and recoil. Why you sabotage the moment things start going well. Why you flinch when someone raises their voice. Even if they're just excited. You're reacting not to the present, but to the pattern. The pattern built by misread words that felt like instructions. Maybe your life isn't broken. Maybe it's running perfectly according to the wrong manual. You can't undo the first misread word, but you can notice when it speaks through you. When you tell yourself, "I'm not good at this," pause. Whose voice is that? Where did that phrase come from? Why does it feel so rehearsed? You've been acting out instructions that were never meant to define you. You call yourself lazy, but maybe that was their projection. You call yourself unlovable, but maybe that was their limit, not yours. You call yourself too much, too weird, too loud, but those words weren't descriptions. They were attempts to control what they didn't understand, and now they live inside you as laws. But what if you could rewrite them? What if each night you unlearned just one instruction, replaced it not with positivity, but with clarity? What if you stopped calling yourself names you never chose? Words rewired you, but silence can undo you. So listen now. Not to me, but to the quiet between thoughts. Notice what you're still calling yourself. Ask it, where did you learn that? Who gave you that name? And if you don't get an answer, maybe it's because the instruction was never real to begin with. You are not the sum of misread signals. You are not the echo of someone else's confusion. You are not broken code. You are still being written. And the next word could be your first. There was a moment, silent, small, invisible to memory, when you misread your first line. It wasn't on a page. It wasn't even spoken directly to you. But something passed through your awareness, a gesture, a tone, a delayed reaction, and your mind, hungry for pattern, made sense of it in the only way it knew how, by inventing meaning. That meaning became the seed. You don't remember the moment because it wasn't dramatic. Nobody screamed, nothing shattered. But your nervous system recorded it like scripture. Maybe you were 5 or 3 or not even speaking yet. But the line was delivered and you misunderstood it. You misunderstood it perfectly. You see, the brain doesn't wait for full comprehension. It makes decisions with fragments. And fragments are enough to build a life. That first line may have said something neutral like "I'm busy," but you heard "you're not important." Or they said "be careful," and you heard "the world is dangerous and you're too fragile for it." Misunderstandings become anchors when they're interpreted as instructions. And instructions, once followed, are rarely questioned. You didn't just hear the line, you built around it. You adjusted your posture, you changed your voice, you made yourself more agreeable, or smaller, or funnier, or invisible. Not out of deception, but out of precision. You were trying to align yourself with a message that you thought was true. From that day on, everything was interpreted through that lens. Compliments felt conditional. Criticism felt prophetic. You didn't know how to separate input from interpretation, because no one told you that the brain doesn't just receive the world, it translates it. And you, without knowing it, became fluent in a dialect that wasn't yours. That's why certain situations still trigger you, even when they make no logical sense. You're not reacting to now. You're reacting to the ghost of that first misread line, still echoing through your decisions. You make plans, but doubt whispers. Don't try too hard. You'll just prove them right. You fall in love, but an inner voice mutters, "This won't last." Don't trust it. You start something new, but the phrase repeats. You always mess this up. You think you're hearing your thoughts, but you're actually hearing the aftermath of one misinterpretation, echoed and amplified over decades. And here's the cruel beauty. The first misread line doesn't feel wrong. It feels like identity. Because you built your choices around it. It's the reason you hesitate before speaking in groups. The reason you explain yourself too much. The reason you doubt compliments and brace for rejection. Not because you're weak, but because long ago you learnt the rules wrong. And the rules became real. No one corrected you. They couldn't. Because no one else knew what you heard. They saw you go quiet. They saw you try harder. Maybe they even praised you for it. But they didn't know your actions weren't growth. They were obedience to an invisible rule, one you never questioned because you thought it was the truth. Now, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what's the earliest belief I've carried that still feels heavy? Maybe it's "I'm not enough." Maybe it's "I have to earn love." Maybe it's "I'm the problem." These aren't beliefs. They're artifacts, fossilized fragments of one moment that got translated wrong and never revised. And the most tragic part, you're brilliant at following that one instruction. You've built whole strategies around it. You've succeeded despite it, or maybe because of it. But success earned through misinterpretation still leaves you empty. It's like running the wrong script to perfection and wondering why it doesn't feel like your life. You might ask, why hasn't it changed? Because the brain is designed for consistency, not accuracy. Once an interpretation becomes familiar, your system will cling to it, even if it hurts, even if it's outdated, even if it was never yours. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. But tonight, we start whispering back. Not to fix you, but to re-meet you. To trace the shape of that first misread line, and gently say, you didn't deserve that. You didn't fail to understand. You were just trying to make sense of something senseless. And in doing so, you built a self out of survival. But maybe you're done surviving. Maybe the part of you that's exhausted is the part still trying to obey a line that was never meant for you. So close your eyes. Picture that younger version of yourself facing a moment, unsure of what it meant. Imagine offering them a different line, a true one that says, "You are allowed to exist without earning it," or "You were never the error." Let that version of you pause, and for the first time, hesitate before obeying. Because the misread line may have written your story, but you're still the one holding the pen. At first, it was just a mistake, an error in decoding. One moment, one sentence, one expression misunderstood, but seemingly small. You didn't realize it then. But that misread didn't end when the moment passed. It lingered, it looped, it settled into your muscles, your breath, your routines. And eventually, it became habit. You didn't plan it. You didn't decide. I will start living according to this misunderstanding. But slowly that single error became the logic behind your reflexes, the background code behind your behaviors. You didn't just misinterpret what they said. You started building who you were around it. It begins innocently. You walk into a room and instinctively shrink. You speak less because once speaking got you laughed at. You over-explain because clarity used to protect you. You become overly responsible, overly quiet, overly careful, because somewhere deep down the error whispers, you are only safe if you stay useful, agreeable, invisible, perfect. And then, the strangest thing happens. You begin to mistake these reactions for you. That's how the glitch survives. You're not reacting to reality. You're reacting to a memory of a misunderstanding that no longer exists in the present, but still governs it. The brain is a brilliant architect, but it's lazy with revisions. Once it builds a bridge from error to action, it stops questioning whether the bridge was needed in the first place. It just becomes the fastest route. And every time you walk it, the habit gets stronger, smoother, easier to justify. You tell yourself, I've always been this way. But that's not true. You've only been this way since you learnt to obey the misread instruction. And the most haunting part? You don't even remember the learning, just the living. It became habit to over-apologize, to hold your breath before answering, to say I'm fine instead of I need. You call it personality, but really, it's a learned posture, a reflex shaped by repetition, not truth. That's the power of habit. It doesn't just live in your actions, it lives in your interpretation of them. The error doesn't need to convince you anymore. The habit does the convincing for it. Think of how many habits you carry that began as protection. Avoiding conflict, overthinking before texting back, smiling when you're hurting. These aren't random behaviors. They are rituals of survival, built around an error that convinced you life is only safe if you follow its logic. But logic based on error creates illusion. And illusions, when practiced long enough, become identities. You say, I'm anxious. But what you mean is, I learnt that stillness isn't safe. You say, I'm just not good at relationships. But what you mean is, I interpreted rejection as evidence and now I repeat it before others can. You say, I always mess things up. But what you mean is, I followed a flawed script until it became a prophecy. It's not your fault. It's how the mind simplifies chaos. It turns the unpredictable into rules. And the first rule you learned, the one written by error, was how to be small enough not to be hurt again. That rule became habit. That habit became home. And now you're starting to feel the walls closing in. But here's the quiet revolution. You can question a habit without blaming yourself. You can see your behaviors not as flaws but as echoes. Echoes of a child who once misunderstood and tried their best to adapt. You can honor the survival and outgrow the instruction. The error isn't angry. It's just tired. It's been speaking through your decisions for so long it doesn't remember the original moment either. But it still believes it must be obeyed, unless you hesitate, unless you pause right in the middle of the reflex. When you feel the need to say I'm sorry for simply existing, pause. When you start to retreat before expressing a need, pause. When you feel the rush to fix, perform, explain, shrink, pause. And in that pause, ask yourself, am I responding to this moment or to a memory? Because the error lives in automatic responses. It survives in speed, but it unravels in stillness. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, listen for the habits that don't sound like you, the ones that play like pre-recorded messages, the ones you follow without question. Ask them where they came from. Ask them what they're protecting. And most importantly, ask them if they're still needed. Because the truth is, many of them were brilliant responses to a moment that's long gone. But now you're here. And here, you are allowed to live beyond the error. You are allowed to create a new habit, one that begins with listening to your own voice, before the misunderstanding speaks for you. Because even if the error became habit, it doesn't have to become your future. You've lived your entire life as if you were the one writing the story. But what if the sentence that shaped you wasn't yours at all? Not something you created. Not even something consciously chosen. Just a sentence, spoken, glanced, implied, something someone else said in passing, without weight, without pause. And you, with a mind like wet clay, pressed it so deeply into yourself that it became a groove, and that groove became a path, a role, a voice, a self. It could have been anything. You always overthink things. You're so dramatic. You're not like the others. Don't be a burden. Be strong. Grow up. It doesn't even matter whether they meant it. What matters is that you did. You took that sentence and wore it like a name tag. You built decisions around it. You avoided certain places, people, and emotions because of it. You didn't just hear the sentence, you absorbed its architecture. You let it write your timing, your tone, your way of walking into a room. You stopped asking questions that made people uncomfortable. You started laughing before you were ready. You practiced smiles that didn't belong to you. And over time, the sentence stopped sounding like something they said. It started sounding like you. This is the trick of internalized instruction. It doesn't stay external. It travels inward. It finds a quiet place to hide in your nervous system. And then, like a skilled actor, it impersonates your intuition. So when you avoid vulnerability, you think you're just being private. When you shrink your needs, you think you're being considerate. When you hide your pain, you think you're being strong. But you're not making choices. You're following a sentence. The sentence that became the self. It's not just metaphor. Neuroscience supports it. Repetition changes the structure of the brain. The more a thought is rehearsed, the more accessible it becomes. And when that thought is emotionally charged, when it feels like survival, it becomes the default, the path of least resistance, the shortcut your mind takes when it doesn't have time to decide. So you wake up and think, I am this way. But you're not. You're just familiar with this shape. You've rehearsed it, memorized it, perfected it. The tragedy? You don't know what you would have been without the sentence. You don't know what desires were buried to fit the identity. What words you didn't speak. What loves you didn't chase. What rage you swallowed. All to keep the sentence intact. To keep obeying the script you never wrote. But now recite so fluently. And worse, you protect it. Because that sentence gave you structure, a purpose, an edge of control. Maybe it even got you praise. You're so responsible, so calm, so independent. You're complimented for being good at following the script. But no one asks who you would have been without it. That version of you, raw, instinctive, unrehearsed, still exists. But they're beneath layers of performance built to match the sentence. So what now? How do you unknow something that's written into your breath? You begin by noticing which parts of you feel like habits, not preferences. Which reactions feel inevitable. Which beliefs arrive before thought. Those are the fingerprints of the sentence. They point back to it, like breadcrumbs through a forest of false identity. You'll feel resistance. The mind doesn't like to lose its definitions. It will say, but I am this way, and you'll have to say, maybe I learnt to be. Tonight, ask yourself, what sentence have I been living? You'll feel it in your stomach. It won't be logical. It'll arrive like a familiar ache. And when you find it, don't try to destroy it. Just sit with it. Listen to it the way you'd listen to a frightened child. Because that sentence didn't come from power. It came from pain. It wasn't planted by cruelty. It was born from someone else's fear. You are not weak for following it. You were young. You were brilliant. You learned to survive using the only language you were given. But now you're older. And survival is no longer enough. So tonight, begin the slow work of editing. Not deleting, editing. Rewriting the line, one word at a time. I always overthink becomes, I think deeply, and I'm learning when to let go. I'm too much becomes I've been taught to fear my own intensity. I'm not lovable becomes I internalized someone else's inability to love. These are not affirmations. They are corrections. You are not broken. You are misquoted. And in the quiet, when no one is listening, you can finally ask yourself, what would my voice sound like if it didn't have to echo that sentence anymore? Sleep now. Let the sentence soften. Let the real self, the one beneath the grammar, the one who's never needed instruction, begin to whisper back. The body doesn't lie. It remembers what the mind forgets. What you interpreted wrong long ago, what they said or didn't say, what they did or didn't do, didn't just vanish. It settled, in your muscles, in your breath, in the tightness behind your eyes when someone raises their voice, in the way your jaw clenches when you say I'm fine. The original misunderstanding may have been quiet, but your body turned it into architecture. This is what no one tells you. Misread instructions don't stay in your thoughts. They become posture. You were told, perhaps indirectly, that asking for help meant weakness, so your shoulders learned to carry everything alone. You were taught that anger made you unlovable, so your chest learned to compress it, to hide the fire until it felt like numbness. You sensed that your needs were inconvenient, so your stomach learned to sink every time you wanted something. These aren't metaphors. These are symptoms. The body follows belief. And when the belief is a glitch, an error in interpretation, the body still obeys. There's a reason your back aches after holding in what you needed to scream. There's a reason your hands tremble when you try to say no for the first time. There's a reason your breath shortens when someone gets too close. Not because they're dangerous, but because somewhere deep inside, closeness got misfiled as threat. You didn't decide to carry it this way. You just adapted. Adaptation isn't always conscious. Often it's instinctive. When the nervous system senses danger, even emotional danger, it adjusts. And over time, that adjustment becomes a permanent setting. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, not just reactions, but personalities shaped by survival logic. And that logic came from one wrong message that got burned into your system. They didn't mean to write it there, but they did, with the way they ignored your sadness, or overreacted to your joy, or told you without words that certain parts of you were too big, too loud, too much. And so your body made a quiet deal. I'll shrink to stay safe. You smiled while your throat burned. You said yes when your spine whispered no. You leaned forward when your back wanted to pull away. You folded yourself into a shape they'd call good, even if it meant disappearing. Now, years later, you think of your body as difficult. It aches, it trembles, it panics. But what if these aren't malfunctions? What if they're messages, not signs of illness, but signs of a conflict between who you are and who you were told to be? A glitch in meaning can become a pattern in the flesh. And the worst part? You think it's your fault. You criticize yourself for being tired, anxious, reactive, but you're not broken. You're overtrained. You've been following a misread instruction for so long that your body doesn't remember what rest feels like. But it's not too late, because the body learns slowly, but it also unlearns. Begin with breath. Not deep breath, honest breath. The kind you take when no one's watching. The kind you haven't taken since you were 5. Feel your jaw. Is it clenched? That's not random. It's protecting a voice that's afraid to be wrong. Feel your shoulders. Are they rising? That's not tension. It's anticipation of being misunderstood. Feel your stomach. Is it tight? That's not anxiety. It's a learned reflex, expecting rejection before it even arrives. These are the places the instruction hides. Not in your mind, in your matter. And the healing isn't to erase it, but to listen. Touch the place that feels tight and say, I hear you. Stretch the place that feels stuck and whisper, you're safe now. Breathe into the place that feels afraid and repeat, we don't have to follow that rule anymore. You'll feel foolish at first, but only because you've been taught to mistrust your own signals, to label emotional pain as inconvenience, to see tension as character, to treat trauma as personality. But your body has been honest all along. It didn't forget. It just waited for you to listen. And now you're here, noticing the exact places where the misread instruction took root. Noticing how a single misunderstanding wrote itself into your bones, and how you, without realizing, spent decades trying to obey it through posture, behavior, silence. But here's what the glitch never expected, that you would survive long enough to question it, that you would feel the ache and not run, that you would trace the sensation back to its origin and say no more. The body doesn't unlearn quickly, but it does listen. Tonight, it's listening. To every breath you take without apology. To every stretch that says, I don't need to fold anymore. To every heartbeat that dares to believe, maybe the instruction was wrong. Maybe I don't need to live inside it. Because you were never the mistake. Just the echo of one. But echoes fade. And your voice, your real one, is just starting to return. You were given a map, not a literal one. There were no streets or legends, no north arrows or borderlines. Just impressions, hints, cues, reactions, emotions that arrived before you had names for them. You didn't even know you were reading a map. You were simply surviving. But somewhere along the way you began to follow it. And it led you here. But what if the map was wrong? Not because it was malicious, but because it wasn't made for you. It was handed down silently by people who were lost themselves. They drew it while wounded. They labeled fear as safety. They marked shame as responsibility. They called emotional distance strength. They warned you about dangers that weren't real and forgot to show you where love actually lived. And because you didn't know better, you believed it. You took this map into your hands and began walking, not toward joy but toward approval, not toward authenticity but toward safety. You avoided the valleys labeled too emotional. You tiptoed past cliffs marked too loud, too much, too needy. You stayed on the path. You obeyed the directions. You followed the symbols. And at some point you started believing the map was you. You said things like, "I'm just not good at connection," or "I've always been anxious," or "I don't know what I want." But that wasn't truth. That was geography. That was you tracing someone else's drawing with your own feet. The map didn't reflect who you are. It reflected what someone once misunderstood about you. And maybe the most painful part is, it worked. The wrong map got you through school, through family, through silence and tension and expectation. It helped you predict reactions. It helped you fit in. And so over time, you stopped asking if it was accurate. You just followed it faithfully. But now, you're noticing the signs. You arrive at destinations that feel empty. You make choices that don't feel like yours. You hear a voice inside you that asks, "Why does this life feel like it belongs to someone else?" Because it does. The wrong map doesn't lead to truth. It leads to repetition, to habit, to emotional places you've already outgrown, but return to out of reflex. You're not broken. You're looped, stuck in coordinates written by fear, not freedom. But there's something they didn't tell you about maps. They're meant to be updated. What you learned as a child was a survival sketch, drawn in thick lines by those doing their best. But you're not a child anymore. You can walk without asking permission. You can look up and realize the terrain has changed, and you have changed. So pause. Ask yourself, whose footsteps have I been following? Do your dreams sound like your parents' anxieties? Do your rules sound like old teachers' warnings? Do your desires feel filtered through someone else's caution? Because when you follow the wrong map long enough, you lose the ability to recognize your own compass. And here's what that looks like. You say yes before checking your gut. You pursue goals that don't light you up. You confuse stillness with failure. You mistake comfort for alignment. But none of that is your fault. You're not lost. You're just using a map that never asked you what you really want. And the more you obey it, the less you trust your own inner terrain. That inner terrain is still there. It speaks in whispers. It feels like the tiny flutter in your chest when something excites you. Even if it doesn't make sense, it sounds like curiosity, like softness, like the phrase, "What if I don't have to keep going this way?" That's the beginning of redrawing the map. It starts not with rebellion, but with revision, with recognizing that the directions you've followed for so long were interpretations, not truths. Misread cues turned into laws, echoes mistaken for instincts. And when you question them, not with anger, but with clarity, the world begins to reshape. You realize that danger was often just unfamiliarity. That not allowed was really just never explored. That the edge you feared wasn't a cliff, it was the start of freedom. The wrong map teaches obedience, but your body remembers exploration. And exploration begins the moment you stop asking if the route is correct and start asking if it's yours. Tonight, as your breath slows, imagine holding that old map in your hands. Trace its lines, see the patterns, notice where it always sends you toward apology, toward perfection, toward silence, and then gently fold it. Not with hatred, with gratitude. It got you here. But now, you draw your own. And maybe, just maybe, the first line of your new map isn't a destination at all. Maybe it's a question. What if I'm not who I was told to be? Let that question echo. Let it stretch across your horizon. And let your feet take their first uncharted step toward a place no map has ever marked. You. You think you experience life directly, that you hear what is said, that you feel what is real, that you see the world for what it is. But this has never been true. You do not experience the world, you experience your interpretation of it. Inside your mind, there is a translator, a silent interpreter who listens before you do, sees before you can, and feels before you're aware. It takes the raw signals of the world and converts them into meaning. But what if this interpreter is flawed? What if it was trained on noise instead of clarity? What if it made one small mistake early on, and everything since has been translated through that first glitch? The interpreter within doesn't ask if its logic is accurate. It only asks if it's consistent. You were told, or shown, or somehow came to believe, if I am vulnerable, I will be hurt. So now, every time someone offers you closeness, your interpreter reads it as a trap. It rewrites kindness as obligation, affection as manipulation. It isn't trying to lie to you, it's trying to protect you. But protection built on old data becomes a prison. This interpreter isn't evil. It was formed in childhood, trained on emotional tones, facial expressions, unfinished sentences, unsent messages. It saw the fear behind your caregiver's anger, the stress behind their silence, the pain behind their control. But you didn't have the emotional language to decode it, so your interpreter filled in the gaps. It said, they are upset, so I must have done something wrong. It said, they pulled away, so I must be too much. It said, they praised me when I smiled, so I should keep smiling, even when I don't want to. And now, decades later, the interpreter still runs the same script. Every compliment, translated into suspicion. Every boundary, translated into rejection. Every pause in a conversation, translated into personal failure. It's not that the world is cruel. It's that your translator is still using a dictionary written during your most vulnerable years. And here's the strangest part. You've trusted it your whole life. You've said, that's just how I feel. You've said, I know what they meant. You've said, this always happens to me. But those aren't facts. Those are translations, conversions. Your inner interpreter assigning meaning to events based not on the present, but on old blueprints. It whispers, stay quiet. Don't need too much. Don't hope too loudly. It doesn't care whether the message is true. It only cares that it feels familiar. Familiarity is the interpreter's drug. If something feels like what you've known before, even if it's painful, it will be stamped as true, because your interpreter believes that familiar pain is safer than unfamiliar joy. That's why it's hard to trust new love. Why compliments feel uncomfortable. Why peace makes you restless. Not because they're wrong, but because your interpreter doesn't know how to translate them yet. You see, new experiences require new language, but the interpreter within resists relearning. It clings to the dialect it was raised on, the dialect of misunderstanding. And so, you stay stuck in loops. Not because you want to, because your inner translator keeps handing you the same misread instructions, and you believe them, because they arrive in your own voice. But now you're starting to question it. You've noticed that some thoughts feel rehearsed, that some reactions feel automated, that some emotional truths don't hold up when examined in silence. This is the beginning of deprogramming the interpreter, not silencing it, retraining it. When you feel the tightness rise, the judgment, the shame, the fear, pause. Ask, is this a direct experience or a translation? When someone ignores a message and your mind says, they're done with you, ask, or is that just my interpreter defaulting to abandonment? When someone sets a boundary and your mind screams, I'm being punished, ask, or is this just my old map mistaking honesty for rejection? These questions slow the translation. They break the reflex. They allow you to experience the world directly, without subtitles written by your past. It takes time. The interpreter doesn't rewrite itself overnight. But every time you catch it mid-sentence, every time you gently ask, is there another way to read this? You weaken the glitch. You update the language. You become less loyal to the first misread instruction and more curious about reality as it is, because there is no universal meaning. There is only interpretation, and interpretation is not truth. It is choice. It is habit. It is repairable. So tonight, lie still. Let your thoughts pass. Watch them come in. Feel the interpreter reach for its old scripts. Smile at it, and ask one simple thing. Translate this moment again. Not from fear, not from memory, just from presence. You might find that what you thought was rejection is actually neutrality. That what felt like judgment is just silence. That what once screamed you are not enough was just an echo of someone else's pain. Because once you see the interpreter, you're no longer just reading the story. You're rewriting it. It didn't shout. It didn't announce itself like some grand trauma or catastrophic moment. No, the command that looped forever began quietly. It might have sounded like care, or caution, or just a passing sentence. Maybe not even meant for you. but your mind picked it up, filed it, installed it, and then it ran. Again, and again, and again. A single instruction, a single interpretation, and from it, a life. You can't remember exactly when it was issued, only that it was early. Too early for language, too early for logic. But your body heard it, your nervous system took it seriously. Maybe the command was simple: be good, or don't speak, or stay small, or earn love. Whatever it was, it felt urgent, felt true, felt necessary for survival. And because you were so young, you didn't ask why, you just obeyed. The brain loves instructions, especially emotional ones. It craves clarity in chaos, so when it finds a rule that seems to make things safer, it holds on to it, even if it's wrong, even if it's based on a misunderstanding. The rule becomes law, the law becomes habit, the habit becomes identity, and the identity becomes invisible, all from one misread command. You see it now, don't you? The same pattern playing out again and again in different costumes. You fall for people who make you feel the way that first instruction did. You sabotage peace because the loop doesn't recognize it. You brace for rejection, even in rooms filled with love. You doubt joy the moment it arrives, because the command is still running. It's not something you say aloud. It doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in sensation, in reaction, in the way your heart rate changes when someone pauses too long before responding, in the way your chest tightens when you do something for yourself without permission, in the way your gut whispers this will go wrong even before anything begins. It is the whisper behind every decision, the shadow behind every goal, the loop that says, do this, or else. You think you're living freely, but you're not choosing. You're complying. But here's the paradox. The command no longer serves the world you're in. It was born in a time that's long gone. Maybe when you were 4 and your parents were overwhelmed, or when you were 8 and the teacher humiliated you in front of the class, or when you were 12 and silence became your safety. The command worked then. It helped you adapt. But you're not there anymore. You're not that version of you. You've outgrown the instruction, but it hasn't stopped running. That's the trick with loops. They don't need updating, they just repeat. They're not smart, they're efficient. Your loop doesn't care if you're happy. It only cares that you're safe. And it defines safety through the lens of the original misunderstanding. So when someone offers you intimacy, the loop says, don't trust it. When life feels good, the loop says, you don't deserve this. When you succeed, the loop whispers, they'll find out you're faking. This is the command in action. But tonight, something strange is happening. You're watching it. You're not in the loop anymore. You're beside it, observing it, asking questions like, why do I keep doing this? Who told me this rule? What would happen if I didn't follow it just once? That's how it begins to break. Not with force, but with awareness. Because the loop thrives in darkness. It needs speed. It needs habit. It needs your unquestioning obedience. But the moment you pause, it stutters. It doesn't know what to do with stillness. Stillness says, I'm not that child anymore. Stillness says, this rule was based on fear, not fact. Stillness says, maybe I don't need to follow you today. And when you say that, when you don't act on the old impulse, your nervous system trembles. Not because you're unsafe, but because for the first time, you're living outside the loop. It will try to pull you back. It will flash old warnings. It will make you feel like you're making a mistake. But that's not intuition. That's the command trying to survive. So tonight, breathe. Feel where the loop lives in your body. It might be in your throat, the place you swallow your needs, or in your spine, the place you brace for criticism, or in your hands, the place that reaches out even when you're empty. Now gently whisper to it. You don't have to run forever. Let the command hear you. Let the glitch know that it's been seen. Because once something is seen, it can be questioned. And once questioned, it can be rewritten. You don't need to erase the past. You just need to stop obeying a rule that no longer matches your reality. The command may still echo, but your silence is no longer submission. It is the beginning of freedom. Sleep now, you're outside the loop. And that is the first step toward living. Not every misread instruction comes from what was said. Some come from what wasn't, from pauses, from silences, from the space between one look and the next. You weren't just shaped by the messages you received, you were shaped by the ones you expected, but never got. And it's in that space between what you heard and what you needed that confusion was born. Language was supposed to be a bridge, a way to connect inner worlds, but somewhere along the way that bridge twisted, warped. Maybe it sagged under too much weight, maybe it was never properly built, and so instead of clarity, you got fragments, half-truths, hints, the beginnings of affection followed by withdrawal, a warm gesture that wasn't repeated, a correction spoken louder than any encouragement. You filled in the gaps. The human mind is a story machine. When something is left unsaid, it invents its own explanation, and if your interpreter was trained in fear, uncertainty, or emotional unpredictability, then the stories it wrote were defensive, protective, painful. They didn't say, "I'm proud of you, so I must not be enough." They didn't ask how I felt, so my feelings must be wrong. They didn't stay, so I must not be worth staying for. These thoughts didn't arrive fully formed. They unfolded in the background, and slowly the silence between words became more powerful than the words themselves. You started hearing rejection in neutrality, criticism in stillness, judgment in eyes that were merely tired. Because your mind didn't trust the absence of meaning, it filled it with danger. That's what it means to be lost between words. To live in the in-between space where you're constantly decoding what wasn't said. To overthink texts, tones, timing. To scan every conversation for hidden meaning. To brace for the moment when kindness turns cold. But here's the cruel beauty. This habit of interpreting silence didn't come from weakness. It came from brilliance. You adapted. You learned early that what people say and what they mean don't always match. That love can look like pressure. That presence can feel like threat. That safety can flicker like a light bulb here. 1 minute, gone the next. So your mind compensated. It sharpened its edges, learned to listen between the lines, to anticipate the worst before it arrived. You think of this as anxiety. But what it really is an old algorithm, still running, and it keeps you busy, distracted, caught in the effort of trying to make sense of what was never clear to begin with. You replay conversations in your head, not to find answers, but to locate the moment it all started to feel wrong. You try to read people's energy, their eyes, their pauses, their breathing, not because you're nosy, but because you were taught that safety lives in prediction. And if the words were never clear, then maybe, just maybe, the truth is hiding in the silence. But sometimes, silence is just silence. Sometimes people don't respond because they're busy. Sometimes the tone you fear isn't cold, it's distracted. Sometimes the quiet isn't personal. It just is. You don't have to fill every gap with fear. And the problem is, the old map doesn't have a symbol for nothing. It can't process neutral, so it turns unknown into danger, turns silence into failure, turns the present moment into a test. But tonight, you get to step out of the loop. Not by changing the world, but by changing your relationship with the in-between. You can start by noticing the moment your brain rushes to interpret. Catch it as it begins to write the story. Catch it as it whispers, "They're mad at you. You said too much. You've ruined it again." And instead of arguing, simply ask, what if this moment means nothing? What if I don't need to translate the silence? Well, what if not knowing is not a threat? You were not meant to be a code breaker for other people's moods. You were not designed to survive on implication. You deserve clarity, and when you don't get it, you deserve peace, not punishment. That's the shift. That's the shift. From reaction to observation, from decoding to accepting, from fear to freedom. You've lived so long in the grey space between words that it's become home. But you don't have to stay there. You can walk out of the fog. You can let the moment be just a moment. You can let the silence mean nothing. Because sometimes silence isn't rejection. It's rest. It's reset. It's a space where your mind can finally stop rehearsing defense. Tonight, listen. Not to the words. Not to the pauses. Listen to yourself. Ask, what am I trying to protect? Who told me that everything must be interpreted? What if I was allowed to just be? And in that stillness, in that radical permission to stop searching for hidden meaning, you might feel something unexpected. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't arrive with answers, only with the absence of the need to find them. Let that be enough. Let the silence stretch without narrative. Let yourself exist between words. And finally, allow the story to stop for just a while. You followed the instruction so well so early and for so long that eventually you forgot it was an instruction at all. It became you. You didn't realize it at the time. You were just trying to survive. You wanted to be loved, to stay safe, to be accepted in rooms where silence meant danger and attention meant pressure. So when the unspoken rule arrived, be quiet, be good, be useful, don't feel too much, you obeyed. You thought you were adapting, but what you were really doing was vanishing. And as the years passed, the line between performance and personality blurred. The mask fused with the face. That's how instruction becomes identity. It starts as a response. This is what they need me to be. Then it becomes routine. This is how I act. Then belief. This is who I am. Until finally, you stop asking. You forget there was ever another way of existing. You think, I'm always the helper, the achiever, the calm one, the strong one, the fixer. But you don't ask where that role came from. You don't question whether you chose it, because if it's kept you safe this long, why challenge it? But safety is not selfhood, and roles are not reality. Somewhere along the way, the original instruction stopped being a strategy and started being a sentence written into your flesh, repeated in your thoughts, practiced in your behaviors, and no one could see the shift, because it looked so much like success. You got praised for being agreeable. You got attention for being resilient. You got respect for being independent. But inside, you felt hollow. Not because you were broken, but because you were being obeyed. That's what identity feels like when it's built on misunderstanding. Like a song you didn't choose stuck on repeat. Like smiling with a clenched jaw. Like always being on the verge of crying, even when nothing's wrong. Because deep down you sense the dissonance. You feel the echo of a self that's been buried beneath layers of instruction. You don't have language for it. You just know something doesn't match. You catch glimpses of your real self in fleeting moments in music, in dreams, in the seconds right before sleep. But then the instruction wakes up again, tells you what to wear, how to talk, what to avoid, and the loop begins again. But now, you're noticing it. That's the beginning of everything. You're starting to see how tightly the instruction has wrapped around your self-concept, how it shows up in every apology, every hesitation, every false smile. You're asking the questions the instruction hoped you'd never ask. Who would I be if I didn't have to earn love? What would I say if I wasn't afraid of being too much? What would I want if I stopped asking for permission? These aren't small questions. They threaten the system. Because when you stop obeying the instruction, the identity begins to unravel. And that's terrifying. Not because you lose who you are, but because you start to realize who you never got to be. You start grieving the version of you that could have existed if you hadn't been handed someone else's fear disguised as guidance. But grief is sacred. It means you're awakening. It means the mask is loosening. It means you're remembering that your identity is not a set of rules. It's a living, breathing, evolving presence. One that doesn't need to obey to belong. Tonight, ask yourself, what part of me feels like a job description? Where are you still performing? Still proving? Still following an old commandment from a story that no longer fits? And what happens if you stop? Not all at once. What? Just for a breath. Who shows up in the silence? Who emerges in the stillness? You might feel fear at first. That's okay. The instruction will shout. It will beg you to return. It will say, you're making a mistake. You need me. You won't survive without me. But now you know the truth. It never was you. It was just a line you learned to say so many times in so many rooms that it started sounding like your voice. Sleep now. Let the performance fade. Let the instruction quiet. And let the real self, the one underneath the obedience, finally breathe. There's a strange ache that follows you, though you can't quite name it. Not pain, not panic. Just a quiet disarray, like a life being spoken in the wrong order. Like waking up in a sentence that no longer makes sense. You move through the world, perform the roles, recite the lines, but something feels misplaced, misaligned, as if you've been living a life out of syntax. Not broken, but rearranged. Not meaningless, but mistranslated. You followed the rules, you said the words, you did everything the old script demanded. And yet your life still feels like a paragraph with too many commas, pauses where there should be flow, repetitions where there should be change. A constant sense that something essential got edited out long ago. Because it did. Syntax is structure. It's not just what's said, it's how things are said. And if the structure is wrong, the meaning warps. If the instruction came early and you misunderstood it, then everything you built on top of it, even if done with care, now lives in the wrong emotional grammar. You may think, I'm anxious. But what if that anxiety is the product of emotional mispunctuation? What if your mind put an exclamation mark where there should have been a question? A period where there should have been space to breathe? You weren't taught how to feel. You were taught how to behave. You were given emotional phrases with missing subjects, directives with no clarity, love with ellipses, discipline with all caps, apologies that never ended in resolution, and you brilliant, adaptive, eager to understand, started filling in the blanks. But without the right structure, what you learned was not truth. It was distortion. You learned to apologize first, even when you didn't know why. You learned to soften your voice, because yours was too much. You learned to smile at moments that should have made you cry. That's how you ended up with a life out of syntax. You were living according to an emotional sentence that kept tripping over itself, never quite saying what it meant, never quite allowing you to feel what was real. And now, every time you try to speak your truth, it catches in your throat, not because you don't know what to say, but because your inner grammar doesn't have the right structure for truth yet. You feel your thoughts, but they come out tangled. You sense your needs, but they arrive as confusion. You chase connection, but something always interrupts the rhythm, like a misplaced comma in the middle of intimacy. It's not your fault. You're not incapable. You're not broken. You're just out of alignment with a language that was never fully yours. You speak a dialect formed from survival, and survival doesn't care about rhythm. It cares about efficiency, predictability, obedience. It rewrote your emotional syntax to make you easier to keep, easier to love, easier to manage. But now you're noticing the awkwardness in your own narration. You feel how certain emotions don't finish their sentences, how joy gets interrupted by guilt, how relief gets swallowed by worry, how peace never arrives without permission. This isn't who you are. It's the structure you were given. But syntax is editable. And even now, in the quiet, your mind is starting to rearrange its lines. What if you paused before apologizing? What if you allowed silence to end a thought, instead of rushing to explain? What if you said, I don't know, without attaching shame? These are not just words. These are corrections. Because when you change syntax, you change meaning. And when you change meaning, you change memory. And when memory shifts, identity follows. Tonight, you can begin the quiet work of revision. Not rewriting your story, just giving it the structure it always needed. Take the sentence that runs through your head. I'm not allowed to rest. Notice its construction. Where did it begin? Whose tone does it carry? What would happen if you punctuated it differently? What if it became, I'm not allowed to rest? Or, I'm not allowed to rest? Or maybe even I am allowed to rest. Do you feel that shift? It's small, but it's real. Your mind was never the enemy. It was just reading the wrong grammar guide. Your body was never the problem. It was just trying to act out a script written in broken emotional syntax. And now you're becoming the editor, the one who pauses before obeying, the one who rewrites when the rhythm feels wrong, the one who understands that a misread instruction isn't destiny, it's just a draft. And drafts can be revised. And drafts can be revised. So sleep now, softly. Let the pages of your past loosen their grip. Let the old structure begin to blur. And let the real sentences, the ones you've never dared to speak, begin to form. At last, in your own voice, everyone acts like they were given one. Some invisible manual. A guidebook on how to be human, how to respond, how to feel, how to know when something is enough. They walk with such certainty, don't they? Like the rules were printed and signed, passed down in clear fonts and bullet points. But you never got it. Or if you did, it came in a language you hadn't yet learned. A whisper, a gesture, a glance mistaken for a message. And so, you made your own. Not because you were rebellious, but because you were terrified. Because something inside you said, there must be a way to do this right. And if no one will show it to me, I'll make it up. That's how the first misread instruction became doctrine. You weren't guided. You were guessing. You weren't taught. You were scanning. The manual you never saw became the one you started writing by hand. Page 1. Don't upset them. Page 2. Stay useful. Page 3. Don't need too much. Don't be too loud. Don't be too weird. Chapter after chapter, full of rules that didn't come from truth, but from tension. Not from clarity, but from survival. And the strangest part, you followed it perfectly. You became what the invisible manual required. You anticipated needs before they were spoken. You adjusted your tone, your volume, your timing. You watched how others responded to joy, to fear, to sadness, and you learned how to mute, perform, and control your own accordingly. That's how obedience gets mistaken for identity. You built your life around a book that no one wrote, but everyone seems to reference. And still deep down you wondered, why does this feel wrong? Why does doing the right thing make me feel invisible? Why does meeting expectations feel like erasing myself? Why do I keep flipping through these pages hoping for one that tells me how to be okay, only to find more rules? Because the manual was never meant for you. You didn't write it. You interpreted it. It was assembled from facial expressions, cultural expectations, parental exhaustion, schoolyard shame. It was a collage of misread cues and vague feedback, and over time you began to trust it more than your own voice. Even now, you hear it. Don't cry here. Don't celebrate too much. Be careful. Don't draw attention. Say yes. Smile. Apologize for existing. You call that your conscience, but is it? Or is it the manual talking? Is it the ghost of early misunderstandings pretending to be wisdom? You never agreed to this contract. You were born into it, conditioned into it, written into it without consent. But tonight, you get to see it for what it is. A book of guesses. A system of rules invented by a version of you who didn't yet know the difference between safety and silence. And that version of you, small, brilliant, intuitive, did the best they could. But now, you're allowed to stop obeying instructions that came from misreadings. You're allowed to stop assuming everyone else has the right way, because most people are just better at pretending they do. Their manuals are just as flawed, just better hidden. So what happens when you stop flipping pages? What happens when you set the manual down? There will be silence. Not the scary kind, but the kind that feels like the first deep breath after leaving a crowded room. There will be uncertainty, because without the manual, you don't know what to do next. And that's the point. Without someone else's instruction, you finally have room to listen to your own, to decide that rest isn't laziness, that wanting isn't weakness, that boundaries aren't cruelty, that joy doesn't need justification. These weren't chapters in the old book, but they can be in the new one. One written slowly, softly, honestly, and maybe you don't need a manual at all. Maybe the truth isn't meant to be memorized. Maybe it's meant to be felt, moment by moment. A pulse, not a paragraph. Tonight, let yourself put it down. The old guide, the rules, the sacred script you never chose but lived by anyway. Let your body exhale. Let your thoughts stretch beyond instruction. Let yourself exist, without a line to follow. And listen. And listen, not for the next rule, but for the silence that means you're finally free to be rewritten. There was a language once, before the instruction, before the distortion. It didn't use words. It lived in sensation, in the flutter in your chest when you were seen, in the stillness that arrived when someone understood you without needing explanation. It was the raw, unfiltered language of the soul. But something happened. You started needing to translate that language, not for yourself, but for others. To be understood, to be safe, to be loved. You took what you felt and began rewriting it, softening it, censoring it, rewarding it. You translated your joy into politeness, your rage into withdrawal, your curiosity into control. Somewhere along the way, the translation became permanent. And now, when you feel something real, the signal arrives blurry. You sense the original emotion, but it's already being reprocessed before it can land. It's already running through filters, already shaped by the instruction. You want to say, I'm scared, but it becomes I'm just tired. You want to say, I need help, but it becomes don't worry, I've got it. You want to say this hurts, but it becomes it's fine, really. This isn't deception. This is protection. And it started the moment someone didn't know how to receive your raw voice. So you learned to clean it up. It's not that your soul stopped speaking. It's that it was trained to speak in a dialect that didn't threaten the room. And now, decades later, you still translate everything. Even your dreams, even your love, even your truth. Even your truth. Because the soul speaks in boldness, but your instruction trained you in restraint. The original language still lives in you. You feel it late at night, just before sleep, when no one is watching. You feel it when a song bypasses thought, when nature says something that no person has ever managed to say to you, when your body aches, not from injury but from silence. That ache is mistranslation. It's the pressure of holding back the truth of who you are in a system that never gave you the words to say it. You weren't born misunderstood. You were just born into an environment that didn't speak your native emotional language. And so, you translated, because you had to, because you're brilliant, because survival sometimes sounds like I'm fine when everything is falling apart inside. But here's the quiet truth. Every translation loses something, and you've lost pieces of yourself. The piece that danced too wildly, the piece that asked too many questions, the piece that didn't want to be small. These weren't flaws. These were original phrases. Phrases the soul tried to speak, but that were rewritten by someone else's discomfort. The instruction wasn't just what to feel, it was how to express it. And that how became a mask, a filter, a new syntax that muted your essence. Now you walk through the world using words that sound like you, but don't feel like you. You say the right things, smile the right way, play the right part, and still, something feels missing. Not because you're incomplete, but because your language was never finished. Tonight, let's return to the original. Not with logic, with listening. Find a feeling, any feeling, something alive inside you. Maybe grief, maybe desire, maybe confusion. Don't translate it. Don't explain it. Don't fix it. Just sit with it. Let it speak in its own voice. Let it sound wild, incomplete, messy, honest. You may not have the words. That's okay. The soul often speaks in sensation before it finds language. It lives in breath, in pressure, in posture, in the tears that arrive before a thought forms. Let it move through you. Let yourself remember that you are not a sentence to be cleaned up. You are not a message to be rewritten for palatability. You are not a concept. You are a presence. And presence doesn't need translation. It just needs space. Maybe that's all the soul ever wanted. To be heard as it is, before the instruction told it how it should sound. Tonight, let that part of you speak again. Not in English, not in logic, not in performance, but in whatever raw, formless hum lives behind your ribs. That is your native language. And it has been waiting, patiently, for you to stop translating long enough. To finally be heard. You weren't handed the truth. You were handed a copy. Of love. Of safety. Of language. Of self. Of self. And the copy wasn't clean. It came with static. A distortion layered into every gesture, every phrase, every response you received growing up. Maybe they said they loved you, but only when you performed. Maybe they comforted you, but only when you weren't inconvenient. Maybe they listened, but not deeply, not really. And so the copy, the version of connection you internalized, was flawed, not evil, not malicious, just corrupted. And like all corrupted copies, it still worked. It still ran. It still looked like the real thing, if you didn't stare too closely. But the file wasn't pure. But you didn't receive love. You received conditional access. You didn't receive safety. You received unpredictable silence. You didn't receive understanding. You received compliance praised as maturity. And your nervous system, untrained to detect the glitch, accepted the copy as the source. That's the tragedy. You didn't know the original. You learned from the echo. You were calibrated not to truth, but to the approximation of it. That's why certain forms of attention feel like danger. That's why peace feels boring. That's why success feels like something you'll lose at any second. Because the copy you were handed taught you that safety doesn't last. That joy is a prelude to punishment. That being seen is the beginning of judgment. And now, every time life gives you something real love, real presence, real stillness, your body panics. Not because those things are wrong, but because they don't match the copy. It's like inserting a clean signal into a system used to noise. The system doesn't say thank you, it says error. But here's the truth most people never tell you. You were never the corrupted one. You were the device. The copy was the input. And the input shaped the program. This isn't about blame, it's about precision. Because healing requires knowing where the distortion lives. And in your case, it lives in the template, the blueprint, the script you were given before you had the power to question it. You copied what was modeled. You mimicked what kept you close to love, or at least near to approval. And what you couldn't copy, you hid. But the system you built was based on broken instructions. And now, it glitches. When someone loves you too clearly, your programming says, wait for the shift. When a room stays silent too long, it says, you're in trouble. When you succeed without stress, it says, this can't be real. That's not intuition. That's the corrupted copy, still trying to make sense of a world that's no longer as dangerous as it once was. But if the error came from copying, then the solution begins with reclaiming the original. Not out there, in here, somewhere inside you. Before the copying, before the instruction, before the masks, you knew what love felt like, what freedom tasted like, what being heard did to your body. It's not gone, it's just buried beneath layers of borrowed scripts. You don't need a new self. You need to unlearn the imitation. To do that, you must become suspicious of the voices in your head that say, you're too much. You'll be abandoned. Don't hope too big. Don't want too loudly. It's safer to stay numb. These are not your thoughts. They are line items in the corrupted file. And tonight, you begin deleting them. Not aggressively. Softly. With curiosity. Ask every voice, where did you come from? Who taught me to speak this way to myself? Ask every reflex, whose fear am I obeying? Ask every moment of hesitation, is this protection or programming? Because once you question the copy, it starts to collapse. And in the collapse, something strange will emerge. Silence. Stillness. A version of you that doesn't feel like a reaction, but like a pulse. That's the original. The part that was never broken. The part that didn't need to be fixed, just uncovered. So sleep now, gently. Let the corrupted lines fade. Let the original template begin to surface. The one that doesn't apologize for existing. The one that doesn't shrink to be loved. The one that doesn't mistrust what feels good, just because the glitch said it couldn't last. You are not the copy. You are the source. And you're finally remembering that you were never supposed to obey what was never true to begin with. It didn't happen all at once. The misread instruction didn't explode. It unraveled. Slowly. Silently. Like a whisper that changes tone with every retelling. Like a childhood memory you're sure was true. Until one day, it feels different. The meaning you built your life around. It shifted. 1 inch at a time. And now you find yourself living inside a sentence you no longer recognize. That's the thing about meaning. It doesn't stay still. It drifts. It drifts. Especially when the meaning is inherited, not chosen. Especially when it's rooted in a misunderstanding that never got corrected. You received a message once, long ago, and took it seriously. Too seriously. And over time that message morphed. Not because you wanted it to, but because you rehearsed it. Don't ask for too much. Slowly became. You don't deserve anything. Be careful. Became you're a danger to yourself. Make them proud. Became. You are nothing without performance. The original wasn't even malicious. It may have been spoken in care. But repetition distorts. And fear magnifies. And so, the first misread instruction, whatever it was, didn't just stay where it began. It evolved. It echoed. It attached itself to new moments and new people. It used every setback as proof. It shaped your decisions and disguised itself as intuition. And by the time you noticed, it was no longer a message. It was a belief. A belief that sounded like your voice. A belief that made you shrink, hesitate, self-sabotage without understanding why. This is meaning drift. Not the loss of truth, but the slow migration away from it. Your inner world became a game of broken telephone. Each experience retranslated the instruction. Each relationship warped it further. Each attempt to feel safe confirmed the lie, because the lie had already become the lens. You think you've always felt this way, but that's not true. You once felt whole, before you began interpreting silence as rejection, before your nervous system turned neutrality into threat, before your identity became a story told in past tense. But memory doesn't preserve. It edits, and the edits get more aggressive with time. So now, when someone compliments you, it doesn't land, because the meaning has drifted. Your brain says, "What do they want?" Or they're just being polite. You feel joy for a second, and then panic. Because the instruction twisted over time says, "Joy is unsafe, don't trust it." You try to rest. You try to slow down. But something inside whispers, "You haven't earned it. This is not your truth. It's just the current version of a misunderstanding you never updated. You didn't choose this software. You just never paused to debug it. But you can now. You can trace the meaning back. Start with the belief that feels most permanent. Maybe, I am hard to love. Don't fight it. Don't replace it with positivity. Just ask, when did this start? Where did I hear this first? Not as words, but as tone, energy, pattern. What did it originally mean? Maybe it wasn't about you at all. Maybe the person who couldn't love you couldn't love themselves. Maybe the shame you carry wasn't yours. Maybe you simply misread a situation and carried that misreading for decades. And each time you repeated it internally, subconsciously, it drifted further from its source. Now, you no longer even remember where the belief came from. You just know it feels true. But feeling true isn't the same as being true. Feelings follow repetition, and repetition shapes belief. Tonight, you get to pause that process. Not erase it, just pause it. You get to notice the drift. To say, this pain I carry, it might not be original. This fear I feel, it might be someone else's. This belief I live by, it might have been twisted so many times it no longer resembles reality. That's how healing begins. Not with transformation, with translation. You take the old message and ask, is this what was really meant? You take the rule and ask, who does this rule serve? You take the fear and ask, what was this fear protecting? And slowly, meaning returns home. Not perfectly, but closer. And when meaning realigns, peace follows. You begin to trust compliments without translating them into lies. You begin to feel safe in silence. You begin to believe that joy doesn't need a reason, and grief doesn't need an apology. This isn't forgetting. This is remembering more clearly. You're not broken. You're just fluent in a language that drifted away from the truth. And now you're learning to speak again. Not in old phrases, but in presence. So sleep now. Let the old definitions dissolve. Let the instruction grow quiet. And let the meaning you were always meant to carry finally return to you. You've been told that reality is what you see, what you hear, what you touch. But that isn't the full truth. Reality doesn't arrive in its final form. It must first be read. And what you read is not raw experience, it's organized interpretation. In other words, it's grammar. You've never just lived reality. You've passed it. Filtered it through the grammar you learned before you had a choice. Not the grammar of verbs and nouns. The grammar of being. Emotional grammar. Cognitive grammar. The rules unspoken, inherited, that tell you how to structure your sense of self. And if the grammar is distorted, then reality becomes miswritten. Imagine living in a world where every sentence ends with hesitation, where every question is interpreted as accusation, where every silence means you did something wrong. That's what it feels like when your grammar has been shaped by fear, when you were taught that the world doesn't just speak, it tests, and that you must pass the test in order to belong. This emotional grammar didn't come from books. It came from reactions, from the furrow of a brow when you cried, from the way people changed the subject when things got too deep, from the moments when your honesty created discomfort, and you decided, I must be saying something wrong. So you adapted. You learned to edit your emotional sentences. You replaced boldness with caution, desire with diplomacy, need with neutrality. Over time, your emotional grammar grew complex, but in all the wrong ways. You became fluent in evasion. You could make pain sound polite, make loneliness sound like independence, make boundaries sound like apologies, and still something felt off. Because the world kept responding in ways that didn't match your intentions. And you'd try to connect, but they'd pull away. You'd speak your truth, but it came out twisted. You'd share your needs, but they sounded like demands. That's what happens when your inner grammar is misaligned. You keep sending out emotional sentences, but the punctuation is all wrong. You say, "I miss you," but it lands like, "I need too much." You say, "I'm hurting," but it lands like, "I'm dramatic." You say, "I love you," but it lands like, "Please don't leave," and you don't understand why. So you blame yourself. You think, "I'm bad at relationships, I overthink, I ruin things," but really, it's the grammar. The syntax of your emotional expression was built on a misread instruction. That early message, spoken or not, said, "This is how you must speak to be safe." And so you obeyed. You wrote every interaction in the language of defense. Even now, your mind autocorrects your feelings. Even now, your nervous system adds disclaimers to your truth. But what if you could relearn the structure? What if reality doesn't need to be translated through fear? What if your emotions were never too loud, but your grammar was just too quiet? Language isn't just communication. It's shaping. The way you speak your inner world determines how it feels. If every feeling must be softened, adjusted, or hidden, then even your joy arrives diluted. Even your peace feels like performance. And over time, you begin to wonder if you even have a voice, or if everything you say is just a safer version of what you meant. But tonight, you're allowed to speak without editing. You're allowed to feel without formatting. You're allowed to exist without punctuation. Imagine writing a sentence that doesn't end with fear, one that doesn't double back on itself, one that simply says, "I am," and nothing more. And nothing more. That is grammar too. Clean, direct, true. You don't need to make your feelings more palatable. You don't need to use passive tone to ask for love. You don't need to layer your grief with humor to make it less heavy. You are not a sentence that needs fixing. You are not a story that needs to make others comfortable. You are a voice, and voices don't ask for permission. So sleep now, not in silence, but in reclamation. Reclaim the grammar of your reality, the natural cadence of your desire, the rhythm of your pain, the honest structure of your joy, because the world doesn't need another perfected sentence. It needs your unfinished truth, exactly as it is. There is a rule inside you. You've never said it out loud. You've never written it down. But you've lived by it for as long as you can remember. And the strangest thing is, you don't even know where it came from. You just know it feels non-negotiable. Like gravity. Like instinct. Like law. It sounds different for everyone. For you it might be, don't be a burden. Stay useful. Hide your needs. Never disappoint anyone. Whatever it is, you've followed it, religiously, even when it hurt, even when it meant swallowing your truth, even when it meant loving people who couldn't love you back, because the rule said you had to, and you've obeyed it so well, that you never even realized it was optional. You see, that's the trick with invisible rules. They don't need to be enforced. They only need to be believed. Somewhere in your past, this rule was handed to you, not as a punishment, but as protection. Maybe someone you loved couldn't handle your full self. Maybe someone taught you that survival meant silence. Maybe the world around you rewarded smallness more than honesty. So you made a deal with the rule. If I follow you, maybe I'll be safe. If I obey, maybe they'll stay. If I disappear a little, maybe I won't be left behind. And the rule worked. And the rule worked. At first, you avoided conflict. You earned praise. You stayed in the good graces of people who needed you to be less complicated. But over time, the cost began to show. You hesitated before expressing joy, because the rule said joy draws attention. You stayed in relationships long after they turned cold, because the rule said leaving makes you selfish. You said I'm fine, So many times that you started believing it, even when it wasn't true. The rule didn't protect you. It contained you. It made you easier to love, but harder to know. It kept others comfortable, but left you disoriented. It taught you that obedience was safety, even when that obedience came at the cost of your aliveness. And the cruel part? You were never asked to obey this rule. You just learned somehow, somewhere, that disobedience would come at a price you couldn't afford. So you followed it. Quietly, faithfully, flawlessly. You avoided mistakes by never taking risks. You avoided rejection by staying agreeable. You avoided judgment by becoming the version of you least likely to trigger discomfort. But now, something's shifting. You're noticing the edge. The tension between who you are and who the rule allows you to be. You feel it when you say yes and your stomach twists. You feel it when you hold back your truth and your chest tightens. You feel it when someone compliments you, and your reflex is to dismiss it, deflect it, shrink. That's not personality. That's the rule. Still running, still in place, still shaping your life, even though you're no longer the person who needed it. So tonight, ask yourself, what is the rule I've never broken? And more importantly, what has it cost me? Because this rule isn't just about behavior. It's about belief. The belief that if you're just good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, perfect enough, then maybe, finally, you'll be loved the way you always needed. But love that only arrives when you obey a rule isn't love. It's performance. It's conditional safety wrapped in obligation. And you were never born to perform. You were born to be known. And no one can know you if you're living by rules you never wrote. So let the rule hear you now. Say it aloud, even if your voice shakes. I'm allowed to need. I'm allowed to rest. I'm allowed to want more. I'm allowed to be human. Even when it's inconvenient for others. This isn't rebellion. This is returning to the version of you that existed before the rule. Before obedience felt like worth. Before shrinking felt like love. You're not breaking the rule. You're noticing it. And sometimes, noticing is enough. Because when something invisible is finally seen, it begins to lose its power. So sleep now. Not as someone bound by quiet laws, but as someone remembering, you were never meant to obey. You were meant to exist. Fully, freely, without permission. Not all rules were handed to you. Some saloon, you made yourself. Not because you were wrong, but because you were trying to survive a moment that didn't make sense. A silence you didn't understand. A reaction you weren't prepared for. A shift in someone's eyes that felt like blame, even if no words were spoken. And you, brilliant, sensitive, hyper-aware, tried to interpret the moment. And when no clear message came, you invented one. Maybe I talk too much. Maybe it's safer if I don't ask questions. Maybe I need to earn their attention. Maybe it's my job to fix this. Maybe I'm the problem. That moment passed. That moment passed. But the rule stayed. But it wasn't written anywhere. You never told anyone. But from that point on, you began shaping yourself around it. You didn't call it a rule. You called it instinct. You called it personality. You said, I've always been this way. But that's not true. You became this way in response to uncertainty. You filled in the gap with a sentence that felt like protection. And then, you rehearsed it. For years. It showed up in small ways. You apologized when nothing was your fault. Or you avoided praise because it made you feel exposed. You stayed quiet, even when you had something important to say. And the more you followed the rule, the more it felt true. Not because it was, but because repetition makes anything feel real. And so, this rule you invented in the quiet shadow of one emotional moment became a compass, one that always pointed away from your own needs. You didn't disobey it. You built your identity around it. And when life brought you opportunities that didn't fit the rule, love that felt too easy, success that came without suffering, attention without performance, you backed away. Not because you didn't want them, but because they made the rule flicker, and the rule had to survive. Because if the rule was wrong, then maybe your entire emotional navigation system was built on error. That's too heavy a realization for a child. So instead, you became devoted to the rule you created. You became skilled at self-limiting. You knew how to exit quietly before someone could reject you. You knew how to work harder than necessary to prove you were enough. You knew how to read between lines that weren't even there, because the rule taught you that the danger is always hidden. But now, you're beginning to realize something. The rule you invented was never confirmed. You created it to make sense of pain. But pain isn't proof. What you felt may have been real. But the conclusion you reached may not have been. It's not your fault. And you didn't have language. You didn't have language. You didn't have safety. You had instinct. And instinct said, protect yourself, at all costs. So you did. You kept things light when you wanted depth. You changed the subject when emotions got close to the bone. You mastered the art of smiling without showing your teeth. But now you're tired. Because living by a self-invented rule is exhausting. There's no rest, no exhale, no room for contradiction. You become the enforcer and the prisoner. Tonight, you can begin to question it. Ask, what was the first moment I felt like I had to become someone else to be okay? And then ask, what did I decide in that moment? What rule did I invent? You may find it sounds like, don't cry, don't trust, don't ask for more, don't take up space. But ask one more question. What would have happened if I hadn't obeyed it? You may find nothing would have happened. Or maybe you would have been misunderstood, but not destroyed. Or maybe someone would have finally seen you. You'll never know for sure. But you can know this. That rule was invented to protect a version of you that no longer needs it. You've grown. You've survived. You've learned to decode discomfort. You've built a life beyond that one fragile moment of confusion. The rule doesn't match your reality anymore. And you're allowed to update the system. Not by shattering it. Just by noticing it. Not by judging yourself. Just by asking, is this still helping me? Or just keeping me contained? Let the rule hear you now. Let it know, I'm grateful, but I'm done obeying. Because who you are now doesn't need invented restrictions. Who you are now can hold nuance. Can be messy. Can feel more than one thing at once. Can exist without explanation. Sleep now. Let the old rule soften. Let your nervous system feel what it's like to not be policed by an ancient guess. Let yourself remember. You didn't break anything. You just filled in a blank. And now, you can write something truer. You remember how it felt. You think of memory as a recording, a reliable replay of what really happened. But memory is not a mirror. It's a lens, a translator, a biased narrator with an emotional agenda. And if the translation was flawed from the beginning, then what you call truth may be nothing more than a misread moment, looped forever through recall. You don't remember what happened. And feelings, especially when you're young, don't arrive with context. They arrive with urgency. They say, this hurts, or this must be my fault, or I need to be smaller so this never happens again. That's how mistranslated memory begins. But with interpretation, not with facts. And the mind, brilliant and terrified, freezes that interpretation in place. It turns it into a narrative, a belief, a label. Not because it's accurate, but because it's emotionally familiar. You may have forgotten the details, what was said, what time of day it was. But you remember the tone, whether the person meant to hurt you or not. The tension, the tear you weren't allowed to show, the cold silence, the breath you held for far too long. And now, years later, you call that memory truth. But what if it wasn't? That's the heartbreak of memory. And what if it was a guess made by a younger version of you with no map, no translator, no one to say, you're not wrong for feeling this, but you might be wrong about what it means. It's not disloyal. It's just incomplete. And incomplete memory becomes gospel when left unchallenged. You carry it with you. You assume people will react like they once did. Into relationships, into creativity, into failure and success. You assume silence means judgment. You assume emotion is dangerous, not because it's true, because your memory says, this is what happened before, and it will happen again. But memory isn't just recall. It's reconstruction. Every time you revisit a moment, you slightly rewrite it. You inject today's fears, today's doubts. You overlay what you know now on top of what you didn't know then. and the past becomes less about what was and more about what you still don't understand. That's how trauma survives. Not just in the body, but in narrative, in the unfinished sentence that repeats, "I must have done something wrong," in the lingering echo, "If only I had been different," in the invisible contract, "I deserved that," because you never fill in the sentence, you just obey it. But tonight, you're allowed to do something radical. You're allowed to misremember on purpose. And the longer it loops, the deeper it embeds. Not to lie, but to revisit the moment from a place of compassion. To sit beside that younger version of you and say, maybe it wasn't your fault. Maybe they were in pain. Maybe what you felt was real, but what you concluded wasn't. Maybe no one taught them how to love you properly. This is translation with empathy. This is not erasure. You don't have to forget the wound. You just don't have to keep reading it in the same language. You can give the memory new grammar. Yes, I cried alone. Yes, they yelled at me. Yes, I learnt to stay quiet. And then add, but I was never too much. I was never weak for needing love. I was never meant to carry their brokenness. Memory doesn't need to be dismantled. It needs to be rewritten with context. And you're the only one who can do that. Because no one else knows the stories you've been living behind your eyes. No one else knows how many times you've punished yourself for something you never caused. No one else knows how many decisions you've made to avoid reliving a moment that was never fully understood in the first place. You're misremembering pain as proof. You're not broken. But pain was never proof. And signals need interpretation. It was a signal. Tonight, you can become the interpreter, one that still stings. Return to one memory. Let it be confusing. Let it be sad. Let it be incomplete. Let it speak in its original voice. And instead of analyzing it, sit beside it. Offer it the truth. And then offer it something new. You were a child. They were human. The moment passed, but you stayed stuck. And now you are ready to move. But to forgive the version of yourself who had no choice but to write the story that way. Not to forget. Sleep now. And when you wake, let the old pages rest. Let the mistranslation fade. But because it's finally been understood, may the memory feel lighter. Not because it's gone, that if you could just figure it out, trace the root of your pain, name every emotion, decode every pattern, then you'd finally feel whole. You thought understanding would save you. You searched for meaning in memories. You turned over every sentence, every glance, every silence. You dissected your past like a puzzle. Because someone, somewhere, told you that knowing was healing. But what if it isn't? What if understanding is a trick mirror, always offering shape, never offering rest? The more you understand, the less solid your truth becomes. That's the paradox. The closer you get to clarity, the more you realize that what you once believed was never fixed. It was a story, a structure, a version. And that version kept changing the moment you touched it. You used to think you were broken. Then you learned about trauma. Then you learned about attachment. Then you learned about patterns. And now you're drowning in labels. Words that promised understanding, but somehow made you feel even further away from yourself. Anxious, avoidant, hypervigilant, overfunctioning. Because now, every feeling must be explained. Every desire must be traced back to childhood. Every relationship must be mapped. You stopped trusting the feeling beneath the theory. And somewhere in all this knowing, you stopped breathing. You stopped being. Understanding is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. And because once you name something, you stop feeling it purely. You experience the idea of it. You feel sadness, and immediately think, this is inner child grief. You feel anger, and immediately think, this is repressed fear showing up as control. You feel joy, and immediately think, this won't last. It's a dopamine spike. Be careful. This isn't healing. This is intellectualized survival. A softer loop, but a loop still. Because even now, the misread instruction is running. Stay ahead of the danger. Don't be surprised. Don't feel without context. And so you chase understanding, relentlessly. thinking that once you finally get it, the pain will dissolve. But some pain isn't meant to be decoded. Some pain is just meant to be held, not explained, not renamed, just witnessed. That's where the paradox lives. The more you try to understand the misunderstanding, the deeper the spiral goes. But the glitch is not a moment. You want to touch the origin, the moment the glitch began. It's a system. A web of partial truths and overextended meanings. A history of interpretations that all felt true, but were never fully real. And when you realize that, when you truly see it, it breaks something open. With softness, not with violence. You stop needing to fix it with insight. You begin to see that healing isn't a thesis. You stop needing to explain everything. It's crying without labeling the tear. It's presence. It's shaking without needing to name the source. It's joy, unearned and unexamined. It's a breath that doesn't need to be tracked or analyzed or assigned to nervous system regulation. It's just a breath. You were never broken. You were just over-interpreted. By others. By fear. And eventually, by yourself. You wanted to make sense of your life. So you built a fortress out of understanding. Tonight, let yourself forget what you know. But the walls grew too high. And now, you live behind them. Safe, but separate. Forget the terms. Forget the labels. Just for a moment. Forget the frameworks. And ask the body. And ask, what am I feeling right now? Not what it means, but what it is. Maybe the answer is tightness. Or something that has no name. Or tingling. Good. Let it be unnamed. Let it be free. You finally create space for what is. Because when you let go of the need to understand, the moment, the breath, the truth that has no theory, understanding is valuable. But presence is sacred. Now, it's time to just be with yourself. And you've spent enough time trying to figure yourself out. You are whole. To trust that even without perfect clarity, even without all the answers, you are safe. You are not a theory. So sleep now. You are the experience itself. Let the questions rest. Let the paradox dissolve. Let the stories soften. You don't need to understand to heal. You only need to stay. Now. Here. Unbroken. Untranslated. Unlabeled. It was always there. You felt it before the room changed. You noticed it before the words arrived. A signal. A knowing. A knowing. You sensed it in the pause, in the tone, in the ache that never had a name. A tiny, flickering light trying to warn you, guide you, pull you back to something real. Not because you were foolish, but you ignored it. Because the instruction said, don't trust that. Because someone once told you, either with words or silence, that your instincts were dramatic. Not because you were weak. Your feelings were too loud. Your gut was unreliable. Your perception was always a little off. So when the signal came, when your body tensed, when your breath caught, when something in you whispered, this isn't right, you overrode it. You said thank you. You smiled. You said I'm fine. You stayed in the conversation that drained you. You forgave the pattern that kept repeating. You silenced the discomfort in your chest and said, maybe I'm overreacting. But you weren't. You were picking up something real. Something the mind couldn't explain, but the body already knew. The problem was that you had been trained to mistrust yourself. The signal wasn't the problem. Trained to value politeness over truth. Trained to stay. Even when every part of you was saying leave. Trained to prioritize connection over safety. And over time, the signal got quieter. It flickered. Then dimmed. It just waited. But it didn't die. Then disappeared beneath layers of logic and loyalty. Waited for you to notice that your fear of being wrong was louder than your need to be right with yourself. Waited for the day you'd pause right in the middle of a moment and whisper, something doesn't feel true here. Waited for you to realize that the body speaks in certainty, even when the mind doubts. You're noticing the micro-tensions. And now, you're beginning to hear it again. The subtle pull away from people who never see you clearly. The soft no in your stomach. The exhaustion that only arrives when you're performing. It never stopped speaking. That's the signal. You just stopped listening. Because the misread instruction taught you to prioritize harmony over honesty. to interpret discomfort as a test to pass, to read the room instead of yourself. But your nervous system isn't a test taker. It's a truth teller. It never lies. When your body wanted to cry, but your voice smiled instead, that was a signal being silenced. When you felt tired around certain people, that was information. When you lost your appetite during a conversation, that was a message. Until one day, you stopped recognizing the difference between what you truly feel and what you've taught yourself to feel in order to stay accepted. But tonight, that changes. And the more often you ignored it, the more disconnected you became from your own compass. You're returning to it. Because now you're not just remembering the signal. Not with urgency, with reverence. You're starting to ask, what is my body telling me right now? What part of me tightens when I lie? What does truth feel like? Not what I was taught it should be, but what it actually is in my own nervous system. What part softens when I'm safe? They'll arrive in sensation, stillness. And when the answers come, they won't arrive in words. That's your truth. Clarity without proof. It doesn't need to be understood to be obeyed. Because the body knows before the brain catches up. Because instinct is memory without language. Because your deepest wisdom never needed permission. It only needed quiet. And tonight, you have that. So listen again. Feel what rises when you drop the performance. Notice what contracts when you say yes too quickly. Notice what expands when you're alone. And finally honest. Not the one you misread. That's the signal. That's the real instruction. Not the one you obeyed for decades, but the one you've always known. Let it return now. You don't need anyone else to validate it. Let it grow louder with each breath. Let it rewrite the story, not with theory, but with truth. Sleep now. You don't need to explain it. You only need to say, I feel this. And that's enough. You're not ignoring it. The signal is awake. And this time, what if everything you think of as you is just a misunderstanding? A constant quiet misfire? A voice relaying incomplete messages to itself, believing it's speaking clearly. A narrator that doesn't realize it's misquoting its own story. This is the uncomfortable theory. That consciousness, your awareness, your inner voice, your identity, isn't built on truth. And interpretation is never perfect. It's built on interpretation. It guesses. It fills gaps. It runs on assumptions shaped by memory, fear, repetition. You are not the original message. You are the echo of a message that was never received cleanly. A teenager hears disappointment and invents failure. A child hears silence and invents shame. Each layer of life builds on the one before it, except the foundation was already warped. An adult hears uncertainty and invents meaning. And yet, consciousness doesn't pause to verify. It builds anyway. So now you walk through the world, responding not to what is, but to what you think things mean. Not to what people say, but to how you interpret their tone. Not to your own needs, but to the way your inner voice translates them through rules you never chose. Your thoughts aren't lies, but they aren't clean either. And because the system has been self-referencing for so long, you never realized it was glitching. Their messages pass through faulty wiring. You feel anxious. So you think, there must be danger. You feel shame. So you think, I must have done something wrong. What if they're echoes from earlier drafts of you older, younger versions trying to speak but misheard? But what if those feelings aren't rooted in the present? Consciousness is not a single voice. It's a conversation. Between sensation and language. Between instinct and instruction. Between the body's memory and the mind's narration. And sometimes they don't align. The body says, slow down, but the mind says, keep going or you'll fall behind. The heart says, this hurts, but the mind says, be grateful. The soul says, rest, but the mind says, you haven't earned it. That's not harmony. You thought, if my thoughts are this loud, they must be right. And you've mistaken the tension for truth. That's miscommunication. But volume isn't accuracy. It's repetition. And repetition is often just fear dressed up as logic. This is where consciousness gets stuck. In loops of mistranslation, trying to solve problems it invented, trying to correct a self that was never wrong to begin with, trying to outrun feelings it misnamed. You feel disconnected, Not because something is missing, but because your thoughts have been talking over your instincts for years. And in that noise, the quiet voice, the real one, gets drowned out. Not in words, but in presence. But tonight, that voice returns. When a thought says, "I'm failing," ask, "Who told me that?" You need to listen differently. You don't need to solve yourself. When your inner voice says, "I'm not enough," pause, ask, "Is this me, or a message I absorbed long ago, now wearing my voice?" When your mind says, "I can't trust anyone," ask, "What does my body say when it's safe?" You'll begin to notice the difference. The glitch speaks urgently. The miscommunication wants answers. The truth waits patiently, not to fix it. The soul just wants silence. Let yourself feel the gap between thought and meaning, but to witness it. That gap is where freedom begins. Because the moment you realize that your consciousness is interpreting more than it's knowing, you begin to live not from the mind's running commentary, you begin to loosen your grip on certainty. And in that loosening, clarity sneaks in. From the wordless place that says, "You are not your conclusions," but from the stillness beneath it. And that noticing, you are not the miscommunication. You are the one who noticed it. That noticing is you, is presence. And so sleep now. Let the voices quiet. Let the narration slow. You do not need constant self-correction to be worthy. You do not need perfect thoughts to be real. Let the mistranslation fall away. You only need to feel the space between the sentence and the soul. You've always lived there. And know, there's a sentence running through your life. You've been writing it since before you could speak. But here's the paradox. You never started it. And you'll likely never finish it. You entered a world mid-narrative, born into a syntax you didn't choose, handed the pen by people who were just passing it along. And still, the sentence continues. It has no punctuation, no agreed-upon subject, no author who will claim it. But every choice you make somehow fits its rhythm. Like, you think you're deciding what to do next, but often you're just continuing the clause. You think you're changing your life, but you're staying true to a tone that was set for you long ago. This sentence, this invisible inherited structure, is the grammar of your beliefs. And even when the words change, the meaning doesn't. It says, keep proving yourself. Don't be too loud, don't be too soft. Be just enough to not be a burden. Stay useful, or be forgotten. You hear it even now, don't you? Running under everything. Not a thought, not a sound, but a pressure. A quiet push to keep performing, even when no one's watching. And here's the strangest part. And you've never questioned if the sentence is even true. Because when something has no clear beginning, you assume it must have always been there. And if it's always been there, you assume it must be right. But what if it isn't? What if this sentence, the story you've mistaken for your voice, is just a continuation of someone else's unfinished thought? Your mother's anxiety, rewritten in your planning. Your father's shame, rephrased in your hesitation. A teacher's criticism, reworded into your perfectionism. So you kept writing the sentence. Each fragment of their language became part of your grammar. Even as it exhausted you. Even when it made no sense. Even when you dreamed of a full stop. There is no period. But the sentence just keeps running. Only commas. Only so I had to. Only. And then. Only. But if I just... You don't rest, because the sentence hasn't reached a resolution. You don't speak your truth, because the sentence was never meant to include it. You don't leave, because the sentence hasn't ended where you expected. Maybe you were never meant to finish it. But maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's the glitch, because the sentence is not your sentence. Maybe your freedom isn't in the ending. In the ending, it's in realizing you're not obligated to continue. You can look at it, not as the truth, but as a template. You can step away from it. It's not your syntax. Where does it appear? But first you have to notice it, and then decide not to follow it. When you're quiet, and it gets loud. When you succeed, and still feel empty. When you try to explain yourself but can't find the words, because the ones you were handed don't fit anymore. Still running. That's the sentence. Still writing you, even as you try to rewrite yourself. The sentence doesn't end, because it was never meant to. And here's the final trap. It loops. It becomes the inner monologue you don't realize is optional. It adapts. It reshapes. Let it run. Don't stop it. So tonight, try this. Don't fight it. Listen as it talks. Just watch it. Let it contradict itself. Let it sound smart. Let it repeat. Let it try to sound like you. Let it sound scared. Then ask, who is this voice trying to convince? What's so terrifying about silence? Why is it still going? Only space. Because in the silence, there is no sentence. And in that space, something stranger appears. Not a thought. Just presence. Not a rule. No meaning. No language. Just you, before you ever had to describe yourself. That's not the end of the sentence. So rest here. That's the first time you've stepped outside it. You only need to realize. You don't need to finish the sentence to become whole. You were never supposed to live inside someone else's unfinished story. You are the pause they never gave themselves. You are the breath between what happened and what could begin again. You think you see things clearly. You believe your understanding is based on what's real. But what if it isn't? What if what you understand, but on what you've already decided must be true, isn't based on what's real? And what if every time you interpret the world, you're not seeing it for what it is, but seeing it as confirmation of what you've already believed? And you're inside it. That's a feedback loop. Let's break it down. You feel anxious in social situations, so you interpret someone's silence as disapproval. Their silence confirms your belief that people don't like you, which makes them less likely to engage, which gives you more silence. Now you act more reserved, which reinforces the belief. The loop closes. It doesn't correct itself. And the more times you go around, it amplifies itself, the more true it feels. But here's the twist. The feedback loop isn't feeding you truth. It's feeding you the illusion of understanding. And that illusion becomes addictive. Because understanding, even flawed, feels safer than ambiguity. You'd rather believe you're unloved than risk not knowing what others really feel, than sit in the silence of not knowing what it all means. You'd rather believe the world is unfair, so you keep interpreting. Keep narrating your experience. Keep labeling. Through a filter built by misread instructions. You don't just live. You explain your living. And that explanation rewrites what's happening, while it's still happening. It's not someone didn't call you back. It's they're ignoring me because I'm not important. It's I always mess things up because I'm not good enough. It's not I failed at something. The feedback loop is complex. The facts are simple. It grabs the facts, through your fears, runs them through your past experiences, through your inherited emotional code, but may have never been, and delivers a meaning that feels true. And this isn't your fault. It survives by connecting dots, by guessing intention. Your brain is a pattern machine, by assigning meaning where none may exist, only to obey it. You were never trained to pause that process, even when it hurts, even when it lies. And so the loop continues, even when you know, deep down, it doesn't make sense. And that's where things get even stranger. Because the more aware you become of the loop, interpretation is the loop, but thought is part of the loop. The more you try to escape it by thinking your way out. The loop doesn't need new answers. You can't think your way out of a misinterpretation when thinking is what's producing it. It needs less input, less labeling, less explaining. You stop needing to be right about what things mean, less believing every interpretation that floats by. So how do you step out of it? You notice the story, but you don't finish the sentence. You hear the voice, but you don't accept it as the narrator. Without describing it immediately in terms of you, you experience the moment, because this is what the loop fears most. When you witness without reacting, observation without judgment, the loop loses power. It spins on meaning. It runs on urgency. Remove those and it slows. You begin to see how many of your life's truths, and in that stillness, and you decided they hated you. Someone once looked at you funny, were just interpretations that got reinforced by your own reactions, and you decided you weren't worth remembering. A parent forgot to call. You had a bad day, but what if? and you decided it meant you were bad. But none of that was true. What if the only reason it ever felt true, again and again, was because you repeated it, until the loop wrapped it in certainty? Here's something even deeper, until it echoed back at you in the tone of your own voice. It got processed inside this loop. You were told to be good. Every instruction you misread, you were told to work hard. The loop decided that meant never rest or you're lazy. The loop decided that meant don't disappoint anyone. See? You were told to be yourself. The loop decided that meant be whatever others expect. The loop is not passive. It doesn't just reflect misunderstanding. It produces it, so you don't question it. And then it hides that production behind feelings. You just feel it must be true. But tonight, you're stepping out. Just by noticing the loop, you've slowed it. You've broken its rhythm. Just by asking if your meaning is the only possible one. And now, not a conclusion. There's space. A pause. In that space, something begins to unravel. Just space. Not an answer. Not because you fixed anything. And instead, but because you finally stopped trying to interpret the glitch, you simply saw it for what it was. Pretending to be the truth. A loop. You think in words. You define yourself with grammar you never chose. You dream in metaphors. Has been misleading you since the beginning? But what if the very language you've used to explain your life? What if the problem isn't what you believe? Language is invisible scaffolding? But the structure of how belief is formed? Think about this. What? It builds the world you live in. You don't just see a tree. Not physically, but perceptually. You name it. You divide it from the sky. You assign it to a category. And in doing so, you remove the mystery, the raw being of it, and replace it with a concept. The word becomes the cage. The language becomes the filter. And the more fluent you become, you say, I am sad. But what you really mean is, the further you drift from what's actually happening. But language forces it into a sentence. A sensation, unnameable, is moving through your body. I, sad. Subject. Am, verb, adjective. Three components that, once arranged, trap a living experience into a static description. Believes it. And the mind listens. Reacts to it. Not to the feeling, but to the sentence. The experience becomes a story, and the story becomes a belief. And just like that, your language was never neutral. But here's the catch. Some before ho, it was inherited, taught, mapped onto your brain, before you understood what a map even was. And told, of emotions, of identities, of time, you were handed a vocabulary. This is how the world works. Or was it just one version? But was it? One interpretation? One set of instructions? Written in a dialect your soul never chose? In some languages, there is no word for possession. So people don't say my pain. They say the pain is present. It's something that continues to unfold. In others, there is no past tense. So memory is not something behind, or me and them. Imagine how differently you'd experience life. If your language didn't lock things into before and after, but what if it's more like a lens, or success and failure? You've been using language like it's a mirror. When someone says, I failed, one that warps, filters, distorts, what they often mean is, and when someone says, I'm lost, my outcome didn't match my imagined story, they usually mean, because existence doesn't speak in words. I can't find the words to match what I'm feeling. It speaks in movement, in raw, wordless awareness. But the mind is uncomfortable with that. In breath. So it names things. It builds a prison of clarity. And you chant new stories. You decorate the walls with motivational quotes. You memorize affirmations, trying to rewrite the glitch, but you're still using the same structure, the same cage, with the very syntax that caused it. Here's something terrifying. Every theory you believe is shaped by the limits of your language. Every identity you cling to, the way you use I, the way you speak about time, even the structure of your inner dialogue. It's all conditioned. You inherited it. You didn't invent it. And yet, you build yourself with it. What if it begins after the sentence ends? But what if your real self isn't something that can be said? In the silence, in the pause, in the place where meaning dissolves. When you walk through a forest, and being just is, and you stop narrating what you see, you begin to feel the trees. Not just name them. That's not imagination. The interference, that's the removal of interference, was language. Not because language is evil, but because it confuses description with truth. You think your life is a story, but maybe it's a song, or a shifting texture of now, or a vibration. And here's the twist. To be real, that doesn't need to be explained. Every time you speak about your life, a version that might be clean, neat, grammatical, you reinforce a version of it, but completely untrue. Never just the overachiever. You were never just the child of a broken home. Never just an anxious adult. Those are linguistic shortcuts. Labels trying to wrap around the complexity of breath, memory, sensation, and evolving presence. But when the words stop, that's where the language of existence begins. What's left? Not with a noun, but with stillness. The language of existence, not with a verb. It doesn't demand an ending. It doesn't judge. Doesn't use punctuation. It watches, holds, waits. And in that space, you existed before you learned your name. You remember something ancient before anyone called you smart or stupid. And you'll exist after all those definitions fade, before anyone told you what it meant to be you. Because being was never something you had to translate. It was always there, for the misread sentence, to finally fall silent. Just waiting. There's a moment, quiet, barely noticeable, when everything you thought you knew glitches. It's not dramatic. No thunder. No flashing revelation. Just a pause. A hesitation. And in that moment, something collapses. A single word you thought you understood, suddenly, doesn't feel right. Because maybe that word, the one you've been using your whole life, never meant what you thought it did. And if that word was wrong, how many others were too? What happens when the final misread word is the one holding your entire identity together? You remember the first time you were called something? Smart, troublemaker, quiet, gifted, lazy. It stuck. Not because it was true, but because it was spoken with enough authority to override your own uncertainty. You didn't question the word. You learned how to behave inside its syllables. You wore it. It felt more real. And every time someone repeated it, like a spell. But here's the thing about spells. They only work if no one rewrites the incantation. And that's what you're about to do. Let's say the misread word is enough. You told yourself, I am not enough. Measured by what? But what does enough even mean? Enough for whom? By a system you didn't design? By a version of yourself you never chose? The word enough became a wall. You were too busy proving, striving, fixing, but you never asked what was on the other side. What you never? Trying to reach a place that only existed in the misread instruction. Zoom out. Now step back. What if love was mistranslated? What if success was misread? What if even the word I, there's a theory in linguistics called semantic drift, was a placeholder for something vaster? A shadow of what you really are? It describes how a word's meaning changes over time, quietly, without anyone noticing. Awful used to mean awe-inspiring. Girl once referred to any child regardless of gender. Nice used to mean foolish. And now you wonder, been drifting all this time too? Has your whole self, your inner vocabulary, you've been living according to instruction? You were given a story, written in a fading dialect. No wonder nothing feels quite right. Told how it begins, what the arc should be, where it should climax, what growth and healing should look like. But that story was built on words, and at the center of it all is the final misread word that no longer mean what you think they mean, the one that undoes the entire sentence of your life. Maybe it's truth, maybe it's real. Whatever it is, it's the word you've refused to examine. The one so foundational that questioning it feels like maybe it's you. Sometimes, Detonation is liberation, pulling the pin on a grenade. But here's the secret. I am broken and must be fixed. Because the sentence you've been living inside, I must become someone to be worthy. I have a purpose I must find. It's programming, isn't grammar. Written by parents, cultures, teachers, fears, and most dangerously, desires. Your own interpretations of those things. To resolve the ambiguity, you were taught to chase clarity, to find the right word. But what if there isn't one? What if the final misread word was the illusion that there could ever be a final word? It's a verb. What if truth isn't a noun, but something you do, not something you have? Something that pulses quietly when you stop trying to define yourself. Isn't failure or hope or destiny the final misread word, where being exists without definition? It's the invisible space between words, the pause before the sentence, the breath after the last line, the place your mind avoids, because it can't survive without structure. In that silence, that's where your real self lives. And yet, no correction needed, no role, no sentence. If I just find the right words, I'll be free. But language was the net. What you keep thinking is the one you keep circling, the final misread word, and silence is the hole in it. Without ever speaking aloud, once you name it, it will vanish. Because you know, that's how you know it's real. Let it vanish. And in its place, the presence beneath it all. Feel the stillness. The awareness, you were never the sentence. And now, you were the blank page it was written on. You can begin again, not with better words. Not with better words, but with fewer, and eventually, with none. Just a knowing, just a breath, just this. You've spent your whole life trying not to make mistakes, trying to color inside the lines, trying to interpret the instructions correctly. But what if the one thing that actually shaped you, as if perfection would grant you permission to exist, was the error, the missed step, the wrong turn, the misunderstood rule? What if everything you are was formed not from understanding, but from misunderstanding? That the right life is the one lived flawlessly. Flawlessly. There's a myth we carry. But look closer. Trace back the contours of your path. Was forged in the places where you stumbled. The person you became, the day you didn't show up. The time you said the wrong thing. The moment you chose silence when you should have spoken. Or spoke when you should have stayed still. The error wasn't an interruption in your story. And it was the author. You learned more from that heartbreak. You discovered boundaried than from all the peaceful days before it. Only when someone crossed them. You found your voice, only after you stayed silent too long. But from betrayal, not from praise, you learned self-respect. Errors are often how life gives you feedback. When you're running a script you didn't write. And here's the irony. And those scripts, those supposed instructions, or love, are almost always misread anyway. You followed them thinking you'd reach safety. But the error, the moment you misread them, or meaning, not all at once, but slowly, was the glitch that set you free, reluctantly, quietly. That mistake made you question the instruction. We often confuse pain for punishment, and questioning the instruction is what begins to dismantle the illusion, not from the universe, not from karma. But what if the pain was correction? What if the error you regret the most was the moment your deeper self, but from yourself, started whispering, "This isn't who we are"? Think about the first time you felt shame. Was it because you truly did something wrong? Someone who was also following, or because someone else misread you? A teacher? A parent? Misread instructions? A god? They handed you a script. A culture. Speak this way. Believe this way. Act this way. With lines already marked in bold. They said, you forgot you never wrote it. And then, when you made an error, it was your foot slipping off the stage. But it's in that fall that you saw the audience. The trap. The spotlight. And suddenly, you were watching it. Maybe that's what waking up really means. You weren't in the play anymore. Just reciting someone else's dream. Not learning something new, but realizing you were already awake. The error shook you, rattled your certainties. But in the crack it created something true. Not because it was perfect. Something ancient peeked through, but because it didn't need to be. You don't need to be flawless. That's the lesson the error teaches. You don't need to be right, to be whole, to be real. The world rewards correctness, certifications, test scores, but your soul doesn't. Your soul rewards honesty, checklists. It's human, and honesty is messy. It's full of contradictions, and typos, and emotional syntax errors, and that's where you learn the most. The misstep reveals the flaw beneath the map. The misunderstanding reveals how meaning is made. The fall shows you the shape of gravity, the more you reinforce the lie that you were broken in the first place. And the more you try to fix yourself, maybe what you thought was an error, it stopped trying to be understood, was the first time your inner voice refused translation. It started trying to be real. Even if real meant confusing, even if real meant getting it wrong. The obstacle is the path. But maybe it's even more paradoxical than that. There's an ancient Zen phrase, not the challenge itself. The misinterpretation of the obstacle is the path. Maybe path, but the way you misunderstood it, fought it, believed it meant something about you. Because of what went wrong, you became who you are. That's where your transformation hides. And even now, but to find poetry in your confusion, you're reading this not to confirm your clarity. You don't want the perfect answer that breaks you open just enough. You want the question. You want the question to let the light in. Was never failure. So what if your greatest fear was buried inside the very thing? And what if your deepest truth, but being misunderstood? What you tried to erase? The error wasn't a detour. It was the teacher. And it didn't just teach you something. Everything. It taught you. You think of typos as accidents. Tiny, forgivable slips of the hand. A missed letter. A space in the wrong place. An autocorrect that distorts meaning, but usually gets shrugged off. But what if this entire life you call your own was built on one? Not a glitch in a sentence, but a glitch in perception. A miswritten line in the instruction manual of existence. And what if no one even noticed? That no one ever proofread. That no one ever proofread. You've been reading the story of your life, as if the plot made sense, as if the words were clear, but there's a strange dissonance, as if the rules of cause and effect were consistent, a pause between what should have happened and what did. That's not what was meant. One that sounds like someone whispering, a quiet hum beneath reality. Maybe the universe doesn't work like a polished novel. Maybe it's more like a rough draft, typed in the dark. And now you're living inside that first version, sent before it was ready. Fingers slipping on keys. The typo version. But no one can explain why. Why? The version where things feel slightly off. It's not chaos you fear. It's the almost. The instructions almost made sense. But not quite. The timing almost lined up. The people you loved almost understood you. You were told you're here to grow. Like a word that almost fits the sentence, but changes its meaning entirely, to fulfill some higher pattern. But what if that pattern, to evolve, was mistranscribed from the beginning? What if someone or something meant to write freedom, fear, and accidentally wrote, meant to encode connection, but mistyped correction? We search for meaning in everything. We stitch stories from loose threads, but sometimes a typo pretending to be truth. What we're interpreting isn't a mystery to solve. It's an error to recognize. Look closer at the moments that broke you. The identities you adopted. The decisions that felt wrong but inevitable, because you misunderstood the rules of the game. Was that your fault? Or was the game built on a phrase that was never meant to be there? You inherited the typo. You didn't fail the system, trying to push through. And every time you questioned your sanity, you were actually glimpsing the original sentence. Words. Symbols. Think of how reality gets transmitted. one nuance is lost. Interpretations. If just one letter slips, everything downstream can mutate, becomes a doctrine of shame. A message intended to empower becomes a command to obey. And you can, a truth meant to awaken, which version was the original? Have no way to know. Caught in the middle. You begin to live a life that feels both scripted and unstable, like walking on auto-corrected pavement. You hear phrases echo in your head. Fit in. Be good. But what if the original message was, don't ask too many questions. Be real. Rearrange the meaning. Break the frame. You were handed the wrong sentence, was already corrupted, and blamed for reading it wrong. But no one told you the manual, what was left in the margin. Maybe the oldest lie isn't what you were told. It's what wasn't said. What was altered with one flick of the pen. We build entire reality on these silent changes. The way a child interprets a sigh from their parent reshapes centuries of belief. The way a single word in a sacred book, the way the phrase, you must be strong, gets misread as you must not feel. We're all living in a typo. And soon, not one we made, because no one stops to ask, but one we continue. The world you experience. What if the instructions themselves were wrong? This is where things get recursive. Who misread their own instructions, was designed by people who passed on their mistranslations to you, who taught you to fear mistake, and so you strive to live correctly without realizing they were made of them. What does correct even mean in a universe that was never proofread, in a reality that was misprinted? Maybe this is why certain dreams feel more vivid than life. You keep chasing clarity, but the ink is already smudged. Why a random phrase, spoken by a stranger? Why déjà vu haunts you than a decade of memories? Feels more real. You're catching fragments of the original version, the untangled sentence that never arrived, the true instruction, not because you were unworthy, so you write your own, but because no one could deliver it intact. You start with the typo, the moment that didn't make sense, the broken word. You read it as sacred. You treat the error as oracle. And instead of fixing it, but was hidden anyway, because in that glitch, you find a truth that was never meant to be hidden by the mechanics of misunderstanding. And when you see that, really see it, it reflects the truth that was always there. You are not broken. The typo becomes a mirror. You are simply reading. You are not lost. You are not behind. A misprinted version of what could have been. And now that you see it, you can choose what comes next. Not by fixing the past, but by rewriting the sentence forward. The next word is yours. You wait for it. Somewhere deep in your body, you're convinced it's still coming. And a moment that will explain everything. Not a thunderclap. Not a miracle. Just a correction. A small revision in the text of your life that will finally make the page make sense. You've lived like someone reading an instruction manual that doesn't match the machine. You twist wires where there are no ports. You follow arrows that lead nowhere. But still, you turn the page. Still, you wait for the next chapter to make it all clear. And yet, it never does. That it unfolds in acts. Because the correction never comes. You were told life has a structure. You can lean into like a ramp. A pike and the law, that there's a narrative arc. But you're starting to suspect one where the main plot was edited out. One where the footnotes contradict the premise. You've been handed the wrong story. Was misplaced in someone else's book. Still, you wait. One where the moment of redemption. Still, you search for alignment. In rituals, in mirrors, in mouths of strangers, who might say the words you were supposed to hear. But those words never arrive. The teacher you needed was too tired. The sign you waited for, the friend you trusted, misread your silence. And yet you blame yourself. Blew past in a gust of unread wind. As if it's your fault. You were never taught to read. What no one tells you is this. And the sentence was written in a language. Sometimes the world forgets to follow up. Sometimes the call for meaning goes to voicemail. That at some point, you spend years expecting someone will pull you aside. Here's the correction. and say, here's what was missed. Well, here's what they should have told you. But that moment never lands. But didn't. Out of broken cues and accidental metaphors. And the most dangerous part? Instead, you build your life. That confusion is clarity. That longing is design. You start to think that's normal. That the ache you feel is just how things are. But no, that's not how it's supposed to be. A version of reality that made room for you. You were supposed to be given not one that offered only silence when you didn't, only praise when you conformed. You were supposed to know how to be held in your uncertainty, how to fumble with grace, without needing to decode every gesture. But instead, how to live in a body. You learned to wait. That might arrive any day now, to brace for the correction. You wait through relationships, through relocations, through reincarnations of self. The sentence never gets fixed. The sentence never gets fixed. And still, you reread your past, searching for the typo that started this. Cyber one bureau. Was it the day you misunderstood their goodbye? Was it the moment you mistook silence for safety? No one told you that the glitch might not be in you. Was it when you translated pain as punishment? But in the sentence you inherited, cultural noise, a sentence built from misheard instructions, the second person obeyed it. The first person misread it, and centuries of echoes. It was gospel. The third person enforced it, and by the time it got to you, the logic is circular. It still doesn't make sense. But if you look closely, the grammar is frayed, the rhythm is offbeat, and you feel it, don't you? A hum beneath your thoughts, that whispers, that internal dissonance. This isn't it. Why? But the world keeps moving. This isn't what was meant. Each one louder, keeps printing new editions of the old manual, but just as wrong. Do you keep waiting for the correction to come? So you face a choice. Or do you become the one who makes it? This is not about rewriting reality. It's about reclaiming authorship with delusion or fantasy, but never felt in your bones. It's about realizing of the sentence you were forced to memorize might be yours, finally spoken without needing permission, that the voice you've been waiting for. It's about standing before the text of your life and saying, no, this word was always a lie. This ending, this part never felt true. I don't accept it. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. You become the correction. You are not fixing the past. You stop needing the correction to arrive. You are realigning the present. You are translating pain into presence. Reader to writer. You are shifting from, no one will announce this moment, but you'll know it. There will be no applause, no red pen to mark your liberation. It will stop being a wound, because the ache will change shape, and start being a doorway. You will still remember, you will still hear the old sentence, but it won't control your breath anymore. The page hasn't been erased, but you'll stand straighter anyway. The way the words twisted you. Oh, and for the first time, you're writing in the margins. But now, the story feels like it's becoming yours. You waited for the correction that never came, and in that waiting, you became the kind of person who could write it yourself. That one misread instruction. It was always there, buried like a seed beneath your every choice. What, quietly bending your life into shape you never meant to grow into. Maybe it wasn't even a full sentence. Just a single word. A pause misinterpreted as an ending. A silence mistaken for approval. Everything branched outward. And from that tiny fracture, a gesture you absorbed before you had the tools to question it. A crooked scaffolding of thoughts. You followed what you were told. A blueprint of misunderstandings. But because it was written before you ever learned to read yourself. And now here you are. Not because it made sense. That you were meant to do something different. Still haunted by the sense. At the end of a journey that never left the page. But the truth is, be someone else. Feel something deeper. You were just trying to survive. A sentence that didn't belong to you. You were never wrong. But by translations. And maybe that's what all of this was. Not a life defined by failures. Shame into silence. Loneliness into strength. You translated fear into caution. Miscommunication. No one else could understand. Not even you. And in doing so, you built a language. The further it slipped away, the more you searched for the real instruction. But here's the final paradox. Because there is no original sentence, there's only this. No final draft waiting in the margins of the universe. The thought you just noticed. The permission you give yourself now. The breath you just took. You are the message. You are here to realize. You are not here to decode a message, but now aware. Still unfolding. Still misread. And let you stop waiting. You stop performing life. And in that awareness, like it's a test you forgot to study for, you start breathing life. Like it's a poem no one else gets to write. Fragments of the old instruction that sneak into your sentences. There will still be echoes, not truths. But now, you'll see them for what they are. But habits. And habits can be unlearned. Let it end in motion. The story doesn't have to end in clarity. You were assigned a movement away from the page and toward the one you're finally brave enough to author. You don't need the world's permission to change the tone, to begin again. You don't need certainty. You don't need the correct instruction, because the misreading wasn't your failure to live correctly. It was your beginning. And this quiet, unspooling moment right now is the part where the story, sleep well, your edits have already begun, starts to read you back.